Snowtown murders involved the killing of 12 people between 1992 and 1999 in Australia by a group which included Robert Wagner and James Velasquez, and the ringleader being a man called John Bunting. Bunting, a former abattoir worker, was a sadistic psychopath who would target people at random to be eliminated due to them being suspected of being paedophiles, being homosexual, or for any other reason he concocted to enable him to torture and murder other human beings. Bunting would get his victims to call him, quote, Lord and Sir, and liked to look into his victims' eyes when they were murdered. None of the perpetrators or victims were from Snowtown, which has become synonymous with this case, and only one of the murders occurred here. But this is the place where the 7-year crime spree came to an end, when the dismembered bodies of 8 people were found in 6 barrels of acid stored in a disused bank vault in the town. This is a story of absolute depravity, and is, by number of victims, the worst serial killing case in Australian history. Welcome to Evil Among Us. This story begins with John Justin Bunting, the leader of the group of murderers responsible for the horrors in this case. He was born on the 4th of September 1966 in the suburb of Inala, in the city of Brisbane, which is the capital of the state of Queensland in the northeast of Australia. Bunting has claimed that on one occasion when he was around 8 years old, he was sexually and physically abused by a friend's older brother, which led him to develop a lifelong hatred of paedophiles. Also during his childhood, Bunting is known to have killed animals. He started small, spending a lot of his childhood dropping insects into acid and watching them dissolve. As he became a teenager, Bunting escalated his behaviour to torturing, killing and skinning cats, revelling in their pain as they died. By the time that John Bunting was around 13 years old, he was a fervent homophobe and racist, bought a copy of Mein Kampf and read it cover to cover, began to idolise Adolf Hitler, going to the point where he spray painted a large swastika on the side of his car. He also joined a neo-Nazi gang. An association with similarly bigoted people inevitably led to his prejudicial views being compounded, and it appears expanded to those with mental and physical disabilities, drug users, and essentially anyone who he considered inferior, or those who simply annoyed him. John Bunting develops an internal quote-unquote code of those who he deemed worthy of elimination, but, as will be shown, this was often on the flimsiest of evidence and was extremely fluid. Essentially, John Bunting was a very dangerous man, and simply being in his orbit meant you were risking your life, as, at any moment, you may have violated his code and end up being tortured and butchered by a man who had no empathy and no remorse for his actions. Bunting's chosen professions appear to be an extension of his emerging fascination with death. At the age of 20, he got a job in a crematorium and seemed to really enjoy the task of destroying human bodies. At the age of 22, he got a job at the South Australian Meat Corporation, the job he absolutely enjoyed, as he was involved in the slaughtering of the animals. He would brag to his co-workers about how many animals he'd killed on any given day. Bunting was, by all accounts, charming and friendly. This made him even more dangerous. He walked through life undetected, as the dangerous psychopath he was. Behind the scenes, his animal cruelty continued unabated, including him killing and skinning a friend's dog. In private, John Bunting had a fascination with weapons and anatomy. He would read books, learning the best way to dismember and dispose of human remains. Bunting kept his darker side hidden and was able to form and maintain both friendships and intimate relationships, although these always appeared to be characterised by a power imbalance. For example, in January 1993, Bunting met an 18-year-old woman called Veronica Tripp, who married just 8 months later. An important detail about Veronica is that she has significant intellectual disabilities and had the mental capacity of a child. She would, years later, when giving evidence in court about Bunting, do so whilst cuddling a teddy bear. The reason I highlight this is because John Bunting surrounding himself with and targeting those who are vulnerable in some way is a repeating theme. Veronica would later state that after she married Bunting, so essentially when she was trapped, he showed his true colours and she was terrified of him. She claimed not to have been physically abused by him, but was the victim of verbal abuse, a witness to his explosive temper, to the point where, when she discovered details of some of the murders, she kept this to herself for years, for fear that she would become one of the victims. John Bunting committed his first murder when he was 26 years old, but it's clear that by his early 20s, he was a ticking time bomb, a man whose life, up to that point, had been about sadistic acts of violence towards animals and the enjoyment from killing living things. A man who had begun researching how to dismember human beings and who had developed a code which enabled him to justify the elimination of anyone who he considered inferior, with him having no empathy for others and no remorse for his actions. John Bunting stood at just 5 feet 4 inches tall as an adult, and potentially his stature led many to underestimate him. And this, coupled with his ability to charm and manipulate others, meant he operated undetected for years and was able to recruit willing volunteers to help him engage in a killing spree, which I've no doubt he'd been fantasizing about for years. And in 1992, the horror that would become known as the Snowtown murders would begin. The Snowtown murders resulted in the deaths of 12 people and occurred over the course of 7 years. Different people were involved in the various murders, with John Bunting, as the years progressed, recruiting people to his cause. The association between the victims and perpetrators often overlap, and some who initially helped Bunting became victims themselves. I'll try to lay out the horror in this case as simply as I can. So the first person to be recruited by John Bunting was a man named Robert Joe Wagner. He was born on the 28th of November 1971 in the city of Parramatta, the state of New South Wales. Wagner's childhood seems to have been characterised by abuse, with him being the victim of a prolific paedophile called Barry Wayne Lane, who, in 1984, when Wagner was 13 years old, groomed him and then began to molest him. Wagner's parents apparently tried to stop the abuse, and, as a response, Barry essentially kidnapped Wagner, and in 1985, the pair went into hiding for the next 4 years, only re-emerging in late 1989, when Robert Wagner was 18 years old. The pair could live openly as a gay couple. However, they were constantly harassed, as Barry had a history of molesting children, and no one wanted him in the area. What Wagner must have gone through the years of being in the clutches of this paedophile cannot be understated. In 1991, Barry Lane and Robert Wagner were living, apparently in a relationship, at 1 Bingham Road in Salisbury North in Greater Adelaide, when John Bunting and his wife Veronica moved into 203 Waterloo Corner Road, a property approximately 200 metres away. How Bunting and Wagner actually met is unclear, but they were soon spending the majority of their time together. It appears that Bunting believed that Wagner was not actually gay, and that instead he'd been ground down by years of abuse by Barry to believe this. The men bonded over their shared hatred of paedophiles and homosexuals, and their admiration of Nazism. It's reported that both of the men were part of at least one right-wing group and attended meetings together before being expelled because their views were too extreme. Over time, John Bunting became close friends with both Robert Wagner and somewhat inexplicably Barry Lane. Barry was the epitome of everything Bunting apparently hated. He was gay and a paedophile. However, it appears that he was useful to Bunting. He would identify men in the local area that were gay, many being friends of his. He would also specifically point out which ones were allegedly paedophiles. In this respect, Bunting tolerated Barry because he was a necessary evil, way to compile a kill list. But, behind his back, he would refer to him as, quote, dirty. One of Barry Lane's friends was a man called Clinton Trezise, who was unapologetic about his sexuality. He was known to people in the area as someone who would often be seen walking around in bright red and purple trousers, leading to Bunting calling him, quote, hacky pants. This was not a term of endearment. That would be something he would say mockingly to Clinton. It seems that Clinton knew Bunting through his association with Barry Lane and Robert Wagner, as he would often spend time at their property. There's little information about Clinton. This is due to how isolated he was. He was apparently estranged from his family and had few friends. I've also read that he had intellectual disabilities. But, despite this, he was a happy, although apparently vulnerable young man. There's no evidence that Clinton had ever harmed a child. However, this didn't stop Bunting determining that he was a paedophile. He used his association with Barry Lane to get information about Clinton and to form a friendship with him, which was solely to get close to his target. The friendship was strong enough that on August the 31st, 1992, John Bunting invited Clinton round to his home at Waterloo Corner Road, and while he sat on the sofa, Bunting approached him from behind and hit Clinton several times on the head with either a shovel or a hammer, fracturing his skull and killing him. An autopsy would later show that Clinton had a broken hand, indicating that he'd put it on his head to try and fend off some of the blows, so he knew he was going to die. When Bunting was sure that Clinton was dead, he wrapped his body in bin bags and summoned the help of Robert Wagner and Barry Lane to help him move the body. Barry offered the use of his station wagon, and Clinton's body was loaded into the back. They drove around 30 miles north of Adelaide to an isolated patch of farmland, where Clinton's body was stripped of its clothing and then dumped in a shallow grave. His body was not found until August 16, 1994, almost 2 years later, when farmers ploughing the field came across his final resting place. What is so sad with this murder is how no one noticed or potentially cared that Clinton had gone missing. The only supposed friends that Clinton had were the ones involved in killing him and disposing of his body, and he was not reported missing by his family until late 1995, 3 years after his murder. A picture of Clinton was sent to police in 1995. It was only using this, comparing it to the skull that had been found, that they could identify the remains of a John Doe that had been found a year before. Immediately after the murder of Clinton, John Bunting, Robert Wagner, and Barry Lane went back to Bunting's home to celebrate murdering a man they claimed to be a paedophile. Whilst Bunting and Wagner were buzzing, Barry was disturbed by what he'd seen and been involved in. I think at this point it dawned on him just how dangerous Bunting was. Barry told his mother and Bunting's wife Veronica Tripp about the murder of Clinton. Veronica asked Bunting whether this was true. He confirmed that it was, but he swore us to secrecy. She kept this to herself until years later, at her husband's trial. Bunting didn't kill again for over 3 years, but he wasn't idle during this time. He created what was described in court as a, quote, rock spider wall. This is due to the fact that in Australia, child sex offenders are sometimes called rock spiders. This was set up on a wall in Bunting's home and was a set of paper notes connected by lengths of wool, which identified people who Bunting claimed were paedophiles. Bunting would frequently select a name from the wall, call them, and threaten their lives, as well as vandalising their homes and vehicles. As well as this, in the years between the first and second murders, John Bunting was recruiting others to his cause. However, some of these people, when they were no longer of use, would become victims. The third main figure in these crimes is a man called James Spryden Velasquez, who was born on December 24th, 1979. He's important in this case, not just because of his involvement, but the details he provided during his subsequent confessions, which gives a real insight into the workings of the group, as well as their methods and motives. Velasquez's childhood was nothing short of horrific. His father, a man named Spiros, was a violent dictator in the home and would regularly beat his wife, Elizabeth Harvey, and for years sexually abused not only Velasquez, but also his older half-brother, Troy Yude. It's unclear whether Elizabeth knew what Spiros was doing, but it appears she had her own difficulties, including an addiction to gambling, meaning that she was often out, leaving the children at home with absolute horror. The abuse came to an end suddenly when Spiros died of a heart attack when Velasquez was around 10 or 11 years old. However, the abuse then began again when Troy Yude, likely replicating the behaviour of his father, began to regularly rape Velasquez. Things only got worse when, in November 1993, so when Velasquez was 13 years old, Elizabeth was approached by a neighbour called Jeffrey Payne, who offered to help and spend time with the boys. This included not only Velasquez and Troy Yude, but also 2 other children called Adrian and Christopher. Elizabeth was struggling to cope as a single mother, and so agreed. What Elizabeth didn't know was that Payne was a convicted paedophile, and as soon as he got access to the children, he began raping each of them, threatening to kill them if they told their mother. This went on for 2 months until January 1994, when Barry Lane, who we've already met, knocked on Elizabeth's door and told her that Payne was a paedophile. So essentially one child molester was outing another one. Payne immediately fled the area, but the damage had already been done. So by the age of 13 years old, James Velasquez had been sexually abused by at least 3 people. It's clear he suffered from severe PTSD as a result of this abuse. He began to self-medicate, using heroin from a young age to block out his trauma. In April 1994, still when he was only 13 years old, Elizabeth Harvey began a relationship with John Bunting. It's reported in some articles they got married, but I can't see that this is the case. Instead, it seems as though whilst married to Veronica Tripp, Bunting was involved in several sexual relationships with various women, including Elizabeth. Regardless, Bunting being in a relationship with Elizabeth brought him into contact with Velasquez, a child desperate for acceptance and a male role model. Elizabeth was enamoured with Bunting, and Velasquez later recalled, quote, "When I first met John, he was so polite, so well-spoken, so well-mannered." Bunting quickly took on a parental role, being 28 years old by this point, 15 years older than Velasquez. Their relationship began normally enough. They would go to the cinema and ride motorcycles together, but Bunting quickly began the grooming process. Bunting was still in the habit of torturing, killing and skinning cats and dogs in the local area, and on several occasions he did this in front of Velasquez and eventually got him to be involved in this behaviour. Also, Bunting showed his young protege, the wall he created in his home, with information about men in the area he suspected of being paedophiles. Bunting referred to these men as, quote, dirty, and like Robert Wagner before him, James Velasquez was privy to Bunting's rantings about his hatred of these types of people. In December 1995, John Bunting found a perfect target for his homicidal urges. This came in the form of a 26-year-old man called Ray Davies. Ray was a vulnerable young man with intellectual disabilities who, in 1993, began a relationship with a woman called Suzanne Allen, who was a former girlfriend of John Bunting. The relationship came to an end quickly when Suzanne's grandsons accused Ray of making sexual advances towards them. Whilst the relationship ended, the pair stayed on good terms, and Ray stayed at a caravan at the rear of Suzanne's property. Christmas Day 1995, Suzanne was spending Christmas with her daughter, Annette Cannon, the mother of the children that Ray was accused of trying to molest. During the celebrations, one of the children stated that Ray had sexually assaulted them, so the family left to go and report this to the police. Ray Davies was already on John Bunting's radar, due to it being reported that he would sometimes be found masturbating whilst hidden in bushes as young girls walked past. Due to this latest incident, inevitably disclosed to him by Suzanne Allen, Bunting decided that Ray needed to die. On the 25th of December 1995, whilst the family were out, John Bunting and Robert Wagner went to Ray's caravan, dragged him out, handcuffed him, and bundled him into Wagner's car. He was then driven over 90 miles away to a property which Bunting was renting, in a place called Baccarat. Here, Ray was tortured, including being beaten over the head with metal poles. Part of this was to extract his bank information. Ray Davies, by this point battered and bruised but still alive, was driven back and ended up in John Bunting's home at 203 Waterloo Corner Road. Here, he continued to be tortured by both Bunting and Wagner, but apparently also present and involved was James Velasquez's mother, Elizabeth Harvey. What happened next is unclear. It's reported that all three took turns beating Ray, with Elizabeth potentially stabbing him up and down his legs with a knife. Jump cables were then placed around Ray's neck, and he was strangled to death. From reports of court proceedings, it appears that Robert Wagner was the man who finally ended Ray Davies' life. Whilst James Velasquez was not present during this murder, both Wagner and Bunting soon told him about killing Ray Davies. John Bunting also told him about the murder of Clinton Trezise in 1992. The men laughed when talking about the murders, and in 1997, after the body of Clinton had been identified, he was the focus of a segment on Australia's Most Wanted, with the programme asking for information. With glee, Bunting pointed at the screen and said, quote, "That's my handiwork." The next person to die was Suzanne Allen. I firmly believe Suzanne was murdered, but at court, the jury was undecided, so no one was convicted for involvement in her death. However, I'll leave it to you to decide. Suzanne Allen is someone we've already mentioned. She was 47 years old in 1996, and despite John Bunting being married to Veronica Tripp and in a sexual relationship with Elizabeth Harvey, he was also sleeping with Suzanne. However, by mid-1996, Bunting got tired of Suzanne, but she was unable to accept the relationship was over. She would send him notes and drive past his property, much to Bunting's annoyance. Sometime in November 1996, Suzanne died in her home. How is unclear. Bunting would later claim she suffered a fatal heart attack in the bathroom. Bunting later told Velasquez that he and Wagner were involved in a, quote, slice and dice, with them placing Suzanne's body in the bath, where they proceeded to skin it and cut it into 11 pieces. The men were clearly enjoying themselves, at what point Wagner apparently held out Suzanne's severed head and tried to get Bunting to kiss it. Her body parts were then wrapped in plastic bags and buried on top of the remains of Ray Davies in the backyard of 203 Waterloo Corner Road. After her death, Bunting continued to collect Suzanne's unemployment benefits and also stripped her home of belongings and sold them. On December the 10th, 1996, Suzanne's brother reported her to the police as missing. They contacted her last-known boyfriend, John Bunting, who, by this point, had redirected her mail to his home, making it look as though she'd moved there. When police attended, Bunting said Suzanne had been there, but had moved out, and told him that she didn't want to be contacted by anyone, not even her family. Given that her benefits were still being drawn out, and finding Bunting's story plausible, the police decided that Suzanne had, for whatever reason, decided to move away and break contact with her family, so the case was closed. Robert Bunting collected Suzanne's benefits between 1996 and 1999 and would provide various addresses to the benefits agency to make it seem like Suzanne was moving around, to make it appear to both them and the police, if they looked into the case, that she was still alive. By the end of 1996, Robert Wagner and Barry Lane had separated. This had occurred after Barry had again been accused of molesting a child in the local area, and the house they shared had been firebombed. This gave Wagner the chance to escape the relationship, and he then declared that he was not homosexual, and began a relationship with a woman who we'll call Kate, who he soon became engaged to. Kate had children from a previous relationship, and Wagner quickly established himself as a father figure within the home. After several years of association with John Bunting, Robert Wagner was now fully committed to his cause and would enthusiastically espouse violent and hateful rhetoric about gay people, people of colour, and paedophiles to anyone who would listen. Unfortunately, in 1997, 19-year-old Michael Gardner would become the focus of both Bunting and Wagner's fury. He was homosexual and a friend of Kate, Wagner's now fiancée, and would regularly come round to play with her children. Wagner apparently tolerated Michael due to Kate, but Bunting instantly took a dislike to him, referring to him as, quote, the biggest homo. However, one incident sealed his fate. Specifically in early September 1997, whilst playing with the children, Michael grabbed hold of one of them and placed his hand over their mouth to stop them talking. It appears that this was a playful gesture, but was seen by Robert Wagner, who was incensed. Wagner apparently found this triggering, as he, as a child, had had a similar thing done to him whilst he was being sexually abused. Wagner contacted Bunting. They both determined that Michael Gardner was a paedophile and deserved to die. To be clear, there's no evidence that Michael was a paedophile. On the evening of the 10th of September 1997, Michael Gardner was at the home he shared with his friend Nicole on Moffin Road in Adelaide. Nicole was away on business, so Robert Wagner and John Bunting knew he was alone. They drove to the property and ambushed Michael, forcing him into a vehicle where he was handcuffed, and then driven 60 miles to 3 Burdekin Avenue, Murray Bridge, a property that Bunting had moved to a few months before. Here, Michael was violently beaten by both men and tortured. His body, when it was eventually recovered, showed that it had been burnt all over his body, most likely with lit cigarettes, with the most severe burns being found to his scrotum. The torture appears to have been used primarily to extract his banking information from him. Eventually, after suffering hours of torture, Michael Gardner was taken into the garage adjoining the property and a noose placed around his neck. The end of the rope was placed over a beam in the ceiling and pulled so that Michael had to stand on his tiptoes to keep from strangling. Whilst fighting to stay upright, Michael had a phone held to his ear. He was told to tell the person on the end of the phone, a friend of his, he was going to move up north. This friend asked why, and the line went dead. Having put in place the first part of their plan to cover their tracks, John Bunting and Robert Wagner sat and watched the badly injured Michael struggle to stay upright. Eventually his strength failed him. He couldn't stay standing any longer, and Michael Gardner strangled to death. Wagner and Bunting then returned to Michael's home, which he shared with his friend Nicole, and they ransacked the place, including taking property belonging to her, and then forging a note apparently from Michael, apologising for the theft and saying he needed the money for his move up north. Over the next few weeks, Nicole got a number of phone calls from 2 men, one who claims to be a friend of Michael, and another who claims to be Michael himself. The supposed friend wanted Michael's wallet sent to him. This was because it had been left at the property by accident, and Bunting needed it to get access to the benefits payments. Nicole told this man that if Michael wanted this, he should come and get it himself. The man became abusive and hung up. On another occasion, a man called who claimed to be Michael. Nicole instantly knew this wasn't the voice of her friend. This man reiterated that Michael left, apparently to go and get a sex change. James Velasquez later stated that he was present during one of these phone calls, which were made by a man that had been convinced to do so by John Bunting. Michael Gardner was the first victim to end up in a barrel. This was a 44-gallon plastic barrel brought by John Bunting to store the bodies of his victims, which was then filled with hydrochloric acid to dissolve the remains. The barrel was stored in the shed at his property. A further 7 people end up in another 5 identical barrels, including someone we've already mentioned, Barry Lane, who had been murdered less than 2 months after Michael Gardner. As already stated, Barry Lane, by this point aged 42 years old, had separated from Robert Wagner in 1996. Like Wagner, he'd begun a relationship with a woman and proposed to her, and used this as evidence to tell people that he wasn't homosexual. However, it's been argued, and I would agree, that this was a calculated move by Barry to try to avoid the wrath of Bunting by pretending that he was no longer homosexual. In fact, looking at his behaviour, it appears that all of Barry's actions were calculated to try and stay on Bunting's good side. He provided evidence on other paedophiles, warned Elizabeth Harvey that her children were being abused, he even helped dispose of the body of Clinton. Due to his relationship with Robert Wagner breaking down, I think that Barry felt he'd lost an element of protection, and so needed to try and claim that he was not gay. However, the woman that Barry had begun a relationship with had children, and when the authorities became involved, the coupling ended. Barry then gave up the facade, and in April 1997, he invited a disturbed young man, 18-year-old Thomas Trevelyan, to live with him. Thomas had a history of mental health issues and was likely schizophrenic. He had intense fantasies about serving in the armed forces and would constantly dress in military uniforms and fatigues. He was known to be violent and often walk around brandishing a knife in response to voices and noises he heard. It's recorded that Thomas had threatened Barry, but this was due to the latter's sexual advances. Although he was gay and a paedophile, Barry was killed, it would appear, primarily because he told several people about the murder of Clinton Trezise. He needed to be silenced before word got back to the police. On October the 17th, 1997, John Bunting and Robert Wagner broke into Barry Lane's property. Thomas Trevelyan was there, but it's not known whether he was involved in the planning of this murder. Barry was handcuffed and bound to a chair. He was then beaten into giving his debit card PIN number. He was then made to assist in covering up his own murder, and was forced to call his mother at around 11 p.m. This call was at the instigation of Bunting, and Barry was told to tell his mother he wanted nothing more to do with her, and that he was moving to Queensland and would not be coming back. Barry's mother heard Thomas Trevelyan shouting in the background, encouraging Barry to be as spiteful as possible to his mother. Barry was also forced to call his brother and convey the same story. With the men feeling confident that they covered their tracks, Barry was gagged with his head bound with tape. A pair of pliers were then used to crush his toes. Eventually, the three got bored of Barry's muffled screams, and he was strangled to death with a length of flex, apparently by Robert Wagner. His body was left on the floor of his home and the three men left. They returned several days later to clean up the scene. They also killed Barry's pet dogs and cats. His body was then moved and dismembered at a separate location, and eventually placed in the same acid-filled barrel as the remains of Michael Gardner, whose foot was cut off in order for the lid to be closed. Barry's disability benefits continued to be paid, but were taken out of his account by Wagner. John Bunting took ownership of Barry Lane's truck and quickly swapped it for another vehicle, telling people he bought it from him. The police did look into the disappearance of Barry Lane, but the case quickly went cold. With Barry Lane dead, Thomas Trevelyan had served his purpose. His body was found by police on November the 5th, 1997, hanging from a tree in the town of Kersbrook in the Adelaide Hills. Due to his mental health difficulties, which included a history of self-harm and suicide attempts, Thomas's death was ruled suicide. However, he'd been murdered. Bunting later told James Velasquez because Thomas began to, quote, fuck up and go mental, he needed to be eliminated. Specifically, he'd begun telling everyone about the murder of Barry Lane, although many people thought this was part of his hallucinations. On the date of his death, John Bunting and Robert Wagner invited Thomas to go on a drive with them. In the vehicle was a box and a length of rope with a noose at one end. When they got to Kersbrook, Thomas was forced to stand on the box and the noose was placed around his neck. The box was then kicked away and Thomas Trevelyan strangled to death. Gavin Allen Porter was a 31-year-old man and another vulnerable male in this story. He was a paranoid schizophrenic who'd spent many years in and out of mental health facilities. He was also a drug addict, and after moving to Adelaide from Victoria in 1997, he soon met James Velasquez. The pair became friends, bonding over their use of heroin. In late 1997, Velasquez, his mother and his siblings moved to live with James Bunting at 3 Burdekin Avenue, Murray Bridge, and Gavin moved with them, although it seems while he spent time during the day in the home, he slept outside in his car. Remember, this was a property with 2 dead bodies in the barrel in a shed in the garden. Why Bunting allowed Gavin to spend time in the property is unclear. He despised him and believed that he was a waste of space due to his drug addiction. Sometime in April 1998, John Bunting was pricked by a used needle left by Gavin on the sofa, and he was apoplectic and decided that he needed to die. On the date of his death, which was a few days after the needle incident, James Velasquez went to a drive-in movie, and when he came back, he saw John Bunting and Robert Wagner in Gavin's car, apparently keening up. Velasquez was then shown Gavin's body in the shed, which showed the imprint of a ligature mark on his neck. Bunting and Wagner had attacked Gavin when he was asleep in his car. He'd grabbed a screwdriver and managed to stab Bunting in the hand before being overpowered and strangled to death with the length of cord. Gavin's body lay on the shed floor for a number of days, whilst Bunting obtained another barrel filled with acid. With this accomplished, Velasquez helped Bunting put Gavin's body in the barrel, and it was sealed. Whilst disposing of Gavin, Bunting opened the first barrel, looked in and said, quote, "They're rotting very nicely." I now need to introduce the last person in this web of evil, a man named Mark Ray Hayden, who was born on December the 4th, 1958. Hayden was described as a shy and withdrawn child, whose mother used to abuse him both physically and mentally. He grew up socially isolated and a few friends. He and John Bunting met in the late 1980s when they both attended a welding course, and they soon became inseparable. Hayden was privy to many conversations between John Bunting and Robert Wagner about their crimes, so he was fully aware of what these men were up to and how dangerous they were. Hayden married a woman called Elizabeth in February 1996, and after this point, he separated himself from the group. However, by 1998, and prior to the murder of the 8th victim, he'd reunited with his co-defendants. I don't have much information about Hayden's character as an adult, but as you'll see, he was clearly as twisted as his associates. 21-year-old Troy Yude was the 8th victim of the group and was the first murder which James Velasquez participated in. Troy Yude was, as mentioned earlier in this video, the half-brother of Velasquez, who'd apparently raped him with a pair of children. Early in his relationship with Bunting, Velasquez had told him about this abuse. Bunting had responded by saying that Troy needed to die. However, despite this, as with other victims, Bunting and Troy had been associating for years, and he was, at the time of his death, living with Bunting and Velasquez. Why the group decided to kill Troy at this point is unknown, but this was clearly a pre-planned murder. The exact date of his death is unclear, but it was likely the 25th of August 1998. In preparation, Robert Wagner had come to 3 Burdekin Avenue, Murray Bridge, along with Mark Hayden, and they'd both armed themselves with hammers. They crept into the room where Troy was sleeping and attacked him, beating him, and when he woke up, he was quickly tied up and handcuffed and dragged into the bathroom. Velasquez said it was at this point that he was woken up and told that he needed to come, as they were about to kill Troy. Velasquez went into the bathroom and found his badly beaten half-brother, now in the bathtub. Troy was further beaten and Bunting used pliers to crush his toes, whilst demanding that he repeat a string of numbers, words and sentences that were recorded, and which would later be spliced together to create a message which would be played down the phone to others to explain his absence. This method of torture was also used to extract his bank information, including his PIN number. Troy was made to refer to the men who were about to murder him by various titles, including, quote, Lord and Sir. In particular, Bunting demanded to be called, quote, God, Master, and Chief Inspector. John Bunting went close to Troy's face and recounted the names of the people he'd murdered so far, no doubt wishing to see the terror in his latest victim's eyes, knowing he would now be added to that list. A rope was then placed around Troy's neck, and a jackhammer was inserted into the rope to act as a twisting mechanism. The hammer was turned and the rope tightened, strangling Troy. It was then slackened, and he caught his breath before the same thing happened again. This appears to have predominantly been done by Robert Wagner, whilst John Bunting stood over Troy, looking into his eyes, guessing off on his terror. By this point, Mark Hayden had apparently left the room, as did James Velasquez, but the latter returned and decided he needed to finish off his brother, so began to tighten the noose around his neck. It appears that Wagner also assisted, so it's unclear who actually killed Troy, but his death was determined, when his body was recovered, to have been due to strangulation. The next day, Bunting and Velasquez went to buy another barrel and returned to the property, and Troy's body was put inside, with acid then being poured over his remains. His legs were still sticking out, so Bunting took a knife, used his skills from working in a meat factory, and cut around Troy's ankle joint, removed his foot, and threw it into the barrel with the rest of his remains, before closing the lid. So by this point there were 3 barrels stored at the property, containing the bodies of 4 people. and the stench of decomposition was becoming more and more noticeable. Bunting and Wagner drew out Troy's unemployment benefits every fortnight, and Velasquez would lie to people about his half-brother's location in order to convince them that he was still alive. Just breaking here for a moment. So far, John Bunting and his gang had murdered 8 people. Later, we'll come back to the issue of motive. Specifically claims that these killings were apparently a crusade to eradicate the world of paedophiles. However, the last 4 murders, in my opinion, show the absolute depravity of these men, dispel any noble cause being at the root of any of this horror. Victim 9, Fred Robert Brooks, was just 17 years old when he was murdered in September 1998. Like everyone else who had been murdered, he was known to at least one of the group, and in this case, it was Mark Hayden. Fred was his wife Elizabeth's nephew and had moved to the area in late 1997 in order to be close to his family. John Bunting became obsessed with the fact that Fred was, quote, touching up little girls. There's absolutely no evidence this is true, but Bunting kept repeating that Fred needed to die. In September 1998, Fred received notification that he'd been accepted to the Australian Air Force Cadets and was invited to a celebratory party with John Bunting, Robert Wagner, and James Velasquez on the 16th of September 1998. He promptly attended 3 Burdekin Avenue and walked straight into an ambush. Fred was beaten, handcuffed, tied up, and thumb cuffs were applied before he was forced into the bathtub where Troy You'd had been murdered just weeks before. Remember, this is a kid who'd done nothing wrong, yet the torture he endured is absolutely sickening. Fred Brooks was interrogated by Bunting about him being, quote, dirty because it was claimed he was a paedophile. In order to extract a confession and his banking information, Fred had lit cigarettes inserted to his ears and his nostrils. A lit spark was also placed into his urethra. His testicles were wired up to a mobile generator, which administered electric shocks, and bleach was also injected into his scrotum. As it became routine, Fred was forced to read out statements from phrases which were tape recorded, which could be edited together to explain his disappearance. These phrases were disparaging about his family and stated that he wanted nothing more to do with them. Like the other victims, pliers were used to crush Fred's toes. Again, Bunting stooped down so he could see eye to eye with Fred and reeled off the names of the people he'd murdered, watching the hope drain from his face. A gag was then placed in his mouth, and tape wrapped around Fred's head. It's unclear how he died, but it appears he suffocated due to the gag in his mouth. Fred's body was placed in a barrel, but this time this was stored at 4 Blackham Crescent, where Mark Hayden lived with his wife Elizabeth. The other barrels had also been moved to this address to give distance between John Bunting and his crimes. Mark Hayden was not involved in the murder of Fred Brooks, but knew what the barrels contained and seemed to have no issue storing them. Again, the banking information was used to take money from Fred's account until the gang's eventual arrest. Less than 2 months later, the gang would kill again. This time they targeted a local man, 29-year-old Gary O'Dwyer. His story is extremely tragic. In his early 20s, Gary was involved in a serious car crash, which left him with lifelong disabilities. He received significant trauma to his head, which meant that he was left with significant cognitive impairments. He also walked with a pronounced limp due to the physical trauma of the crash. Due to this, he was unable to work and received a disability pension. He had no family to care for him, and so lived a solitary and lonely life at 23 Francis Street, Murray Bridge, which is a road that intersects with Burdekin Avenue, where the murder gang was based. Gary was frequently seen in the local area, just trying to get on with his life. This included being spotted by John Bunting and Robert Wagner, who would, behind his back, mock him. Bunting stated that Gary was a, quote, fag and dirty, and that he needed to, quote, go to the clinic, which was a euphemism for murder. There's no evidence that Gary was gay or a paedophile or anything but a vulnerable man who Bunting saw as an easy target. And, whilst he espoused his usual hate to others, he tasked Velasquez with befriending Gary and gathering information on him, specifically how much money he had coming in and whether he had any family. So essentially, was he worth killing, and would anyone notice his absence? Velasquez followed the instructions and befriended their target. When it was found that Gary's murder was worth it, a quote-unquote party was arranged at his house on the 27th of October 1998. In attendance were James Velasquez, John Bunting, and Robert Wagner. They even brought beer to complete the illusion that Gary was going to spend time with his new friends. However, what Gary did not spot was the portable generator that had been brought to the property, the same one used to torture Fred Brooks. After only 20 minutes, and without warning, Robert Wagner grabbed Gary around the neck, began to strangle him. Bunting jumped in and said, quote, "Stop, you're killing him." However, this was simply telling Wagner to stop before he went too far, as they needed to extract information from this poor man. Gary was beaten and probes attached to various parts of his body, electric shocks applied, in order to extract his bank information and to get him to record statements about the fact he was leaving the area and wanted no one to look for him. Velasquez held Gary down whilst the other two men took the lead. Gary was tortured for hours and eventually strangled to death with a piece of rope by either Bunting or Wagner. His body was placed into a newly bought barrel and transported to the property of Mark and Elizabeth Hayden, where it was stored along with the others. John Bunting then stripped all of Gary's possessions from his home, killing his furniture, which was either sold or divvied up by the murderers. Gary's sofa was later found in Mark Hayden's living room. Bunting told the neighbours that Gary had had some trouble with some local Aboriginals and had left the area due to fear for his life and would return when the heat died down. Between October 1998 and February 1999, Gary O'Dwyer's disability pension was drawn out repeatedly by the men. Victim 11, the penultimate victim, was the crime that would eventually lead to the downfall of the group, and again was an individual who had no link to any alleged sexual offences and who was extremely vulnerable. This person was 37-year-old Elizabeth Hayden, wife of Mark Hayden. Elizabeth was a woman with significant physical and intellectual difficulties. She was also overweight, which seemed to really annoy Bunting, with him referring to her as disgusting and a waste of flesh. He would, behind Mark Hayden's back, refer to his wife as a, quote, whore and lowlife. The reason for Elizabeth's murder was primarily to silence a potential witness, as Mark Hayden had told his wife about the murders, so she needed to be eliminated. This murder shows the depravity and heartlessness of Mark Hayden, as it appears that he was fully aware of the plan to murder his wife. On the 21st November 1998, Mark Hayden and Elizabeth were visited by John Bunting and Robert Wagner at their home at 4 Black and Crescent. Eventually, Mark Hayden left the property. It seems he was fine with his wife being murdered, he just didn't want to see it happen. After he'd left, Elizabeth was attacked by Bunting and Wagner. She was dragged into the bathroom, handcuffed, and a sock forced into her mouth secured with tape around her head. She was then beaten and tortured, before eventually being strangled to death by either Wagner or Bunting, using a noose that had been placed around her neck. Her body was then taken to the shed at the back of the property and placed in an acid-filled barrel, which joined the other 5 already stored there. As I said, not much is known about Mark Hayden, but it's clear that he was just as sick as his associates, due to firstly appearing to know that his wife was going to be murdered and allowing this to happen. But when he returned to the property, he was shown his wife's remains in the barrel. When he saw her body, he simply laughed. Elizabeth's murder would be the beginning of the end. Unlike the other victims, her absence was noticed quickly, and within 3 days of her murder, her brother reported her as a missing person to the police, and they began an investigation. On the 26th of November 1998, they attended 4 Black and Crescent and spoke to Mark Hayden about his wife's disappearance. He was edgy, but the police had no reasons to search his property at that point. Little did they know they were standing less than 50 metres from barrels containing 7 dead bodies. They left, but their involvement signified the beginning of the end, but not before one final murder. The presence of the police so soon after the murder of Elizabeth Hayden spooked all those involved, and they realised they needed to move the barrels to a new location. Initially, the 6 barrels were loaded onto the back of Mark Hayden's Land Cruiser and driven to the property of a couple that John Bunting knew in Snowtown. We shall call them Stephen and Julie. This is the first mention of the location that's become synonymous with this case. Snowtown is a quiet town, 145 kilometres or around 90 miles north of Adelaide, and only has a population of around 400 people. It's isolated. Before these crimes, most people had never heard of it. However, quickly, Bunting was asked by Stephen and Julie to move the Land Cruiser off their property due to the stench coming from the vehicle, and it was then, in January 1999, the group found an old disused bank in the town, and it was quickly decided that this property, this out-of-the-way town, would be the perfect place to store the bodies of those already killed, but also those who would be murdered in the future. Mark Hayden and John Bunting co-signed the lease for the bank, and, along with Robert Wagner and James Velasquez, the 6 barrels were moved into the area, which used to be the bank's vault. However, advisable detail is that the Land Cruiser, although now empty, was left parked on the property of Stephen and Julie. Some of the barrels were opened and several of the bodies cut into smaller pieces. This was likely because they'd not dissolved as expected, but we'll return to this later. With the bodies out the way, no doubt the men felt as though they were likely to get away with their crimes, and so they started planning more murders. The 12th and last victim was 24-year-old David Johnson, the stepbrother of James Velasquez. John Bunting never liked David, primarily because he was fastidious about his cleanliness and appearance. But instead of seeing this as a young man who just wished to take care of himself, Bunting described this as evidence of him being a, quote, faggot. Bunting told Velasquez that David needed to die, and they came up with a plan to lure him to the bank. Specifically, Velasquez was to offer his stepbrother a computer for sale, and offers to take him to see it. However, instead, he'll be taken to the bank and murdered. Velasquez agreed to the plan, and having piqued his stepbrother's interest in potentially buying a computer, on the 9th of May 1999, he drove his vehicle to the bank in Snowtown, with David following behind in his own car. The pair entered through the side door of the bank, and as soon as they walked in, David Johnson was ambushed. Robert Wagner grabbed David around the neck, and Bunting placed him in handcuffs. Bunting told David that everything was going to be okay. He just wanted to ask him some questions, and that he'd be able to leave when he gave the answers, which should be in around 30 minutes to an hour. David was beaten, flesh cut from his body using a Stanley knife in order to obtain his bank card PIN number. He was also forced to record pre-prepared statements, which would be left on answer phone messages to his friends and family to cover the murderer's tracks. The other men then left to try and take out money with the bank card, leaving Bunting and David alone. David, knowing that he was about to die, made a last-ditch attempt at freedom and charged at his captor. Johnson managed to break several of Bunting's ribs, but with his hands restrained, he was at a disadvantage, and eventually Bunting got the upper hand and was able to remove David's belt, which he then used to strangle him to death. The men then set about to, quote, slice and dice, and dismembered the body of David Johnson. However, then, as if these men were not evil enough, Velasquez later claimed that he had seen Bunting and Wagner cooking part of David's flesh that had been cut away earlier and eating it. David's remains were placed in one of the barrels already in the vault, meaning that there were now 6 barrels with the remains of 8 people in them. No doubt the plan was to have a steady stream of victims lured into the bank and essentially have a conveyor belt of murder and dismemberment. But the group's days were numbered. They just didn't realize it yet. By the time of the murder of David Johnson in May 1999, a major police investigation was already underway due to the disappearance of Elizabeth Hayden. Police who spoke to her husband, Mark Hayden, in November 1998 were unconvinced by his story and noticed how nervous he was. When they returned later to make further inquiries, they were told by neighbours about a Land Cruiser being used to transport barrels, which stank. The police looked into the case more thoroughly, and in particular missing person reports in the city of Adelaide. It transpired that they were already suspicious about the men. As early as July 1998, police had become aware that Robert Wagner was withdrawing money from the account of Barry Lane, with him being caught on camera doing this. This was despite no one having seen Barry for months. Missing person reports were compiled for disappearances in the Adelaide area, and diligent police work established connections between Robert Wagner and 5 missing person cases. These were Clinton Trezise, Susan Allen, Barry Lane, Elizabeth Hayden, and Ray Davies. This was due to his personal links to these individuals, but also unusual activity on the bank accounts of some of these people, with evidence suggesting people, including him, have been taking money out long after these people had last been seen. Soon, the connection between Wagner and Bunting was established. The evidence led them to believe that Elizabeth Hayden had likely come to harm, and her disappearance was considered a major crime, which meant the police had more money and scope to act. This led to police being given the authority to tap the phones of Robert Wagner and John Bunting, which then led them to identify Mark Hayden and James Velasquez as being part of the group. On May the 20th, 1999, Mark Hayden was followed by police who travelled to Snowtown. As the officers were driving along, they spotted the Land Cruiser they'd been looking for, parked outside the property of Stephen and Julie. Despite the vehicle being empty, the officers noted the smell of decomposition, and when they knocked on the door, the conversation with the couple unlocked the key to everything. Stephen and Julie told the police that the Land Cruiser had been parked outside their home with barrels in it. Because they smelled so bad, they told their friend, John Bunting, to move them, and they knew that he and his friends had rented the abandoned bank in town. The police descended in force from the bank. They entered the property and progressed to the vault. They walked through plastic sheeting, which had been attached to the door frame to try to conceal the smell of death, and into a room with 6 barrels. The smell of decomposition was overpowering. Officers opened each barrel in turn and filmed the contents, and were able to establish, to their horror, that as opposed to the 5 missing people they were concerned about, they were staring at the remains of 8 people. The police acted quickly. The next day, the 21st of May 1999, John Bunting, Robert Wagner, and Mark Hayden were all arrested and taken into custody. In the same afternoon, all 3 were charged with a single count of murder of a person unknown. Inevitably, this was a holding charge, while the horror of this case was being unravelled. James Velasquez was arrested separately on the 23rd of May 1999 and immediately confessed. He spent the next 6 days saying to the police everything, every murder and every detail. This allowed the police to recover the bodies of Suzanne Allen and Gray Davies at Bunting's former home at 203 Waterloo Corner Road. He was also able to correct them that the death of Thomas Trevelyan, who had been found hanging, was not a suicide, but another murder. In total, James Velasquez gave the police details related to 12 murders. The bodies recovered were examined, but despite thinking it was very smart, as John Bunting had used hydrochloric acid as opposed to sulfuric acid, the bodies had not dissolved entirely and were mostly mummified, which meant identification of the remains from DNA, fingerprints, distinguishing features, etc. was much easier. It also meant that the catalogue of wounds of each victim could be documented, which enabled the confession of James Velasquez to be corroborated, essentially sealing the fate of all the men. Based on this evidence, John Bunting, Mark Hayden, and Robert Wagner were charged with 11 murders based on joint enterprise, which is a concept whereby, in this case, regardless of who actually killed each victim, they were all involved in creating the circumstances where they knew a person would be murdered, and so they were all equally culpable for the outcome. John Bunting was also charged separately for the murder of Clinton Trezise. James Velasquez confessed to and was charged with direct involvement in the murders of his stepbrother David Johnson, his half-brother Troy Yude, as well as Gary O'Dwyer and Fred Brooks. All men were remanded into custody to await their day in court. James Velasquez pleaded guilty to the 4 murders he'd confessed to at the first opportunity. On June the 21st, 2001, Velasquez, now aged 21 years old, appeared at the South Australian Supreme Court for sentence. He was sentenced to 4 terms of life imprisonment with a minimum tariff of 26 years. This sentence was in exchange for his full cooperation with the legal proceedings of his co-defendants, including giving evidence against them. In return, James Velasquez was being given some hope of release, despite the horrific things he'd done, although this would only be after serving longer than he'd been alive by this point in prison. On August the 13th, 2002, John Bunting, Robert Wagner, and Mark Hayden pleaded not guilty to all charges and were remanded to prison to await their trial date. Quickly, the case against Mark Hayden fell apart. They simply didn't have enough evidence to convict him of murder of any of the victims. I think it's clear that he was more involved than the court were able to prove, so he was eventually convicted of 7 counts of assisting in the murders of 7 of the victims. This primarily related to him transporting and storing their bodies. Mark Hayden was sentenced to 25 years imprisonment, with him having to serve 18 years of this for his role in the Snowtown murders. On September the 27th, 2002, Robert Wagner admitted to 3 murders, those of Barry Lane, Fred Brooks, and David Johnson. This was prior to the start of his trial in October of that year. I've no doubt this was tactical. I believe that Wagner was hoping that by admitting some of his crimes, he would get a sentence like Velasquez, which would mean that he might see the light of day again. He was mistaken. John Bunting and Robert Wagner's trial started at the South Australian Supreme Court on October the 22nd, 2002. The star witness against both men was James Velasquez. The trial lasted almost a year, and on the 8th of September 2003, the jury delivered their verdicts. As I've already stated, the jury were unable to reach a verdict on the murder of Suzanne Allen, as they could not rule out that her death was due to natural causes. However, John Bunting and Robert Wagner were both convicted of the murders of Ray Davies, Michael Gardner, Barry Lane, Thomas Trevelyan, Gavin Porter, Troy Yude, Fred Brooks, Gary O'Dwyer, Elizabeth Hayden, and David Johnson. In addition, John Bunting was convicted of the 1992 murder of Clint Richard's. These verdicts meant that these two men are amongst the most prolific serial killers in Australian history. On October the 29th, 2003, both men appeared before Justice Brian Martin for sentence. Justice Martin identified John Bunting as the ringleader and addressed both men saying, quote, "Your crimes were premeditated and a number of them involved considerable planning and preparation. I'm satisfied that both of you derived pleasure from the physical act of killing and the violence and torture that preceded some of the killings. It's not an exaggeration to say you were in the business of killing for pleasure." He continued, quote, "The evidence presented during the murder trial has drawn me to the conclusion that both of you are incapable of true rehabilitation." He then sentenced them. Both John Bunting and Robert Wagner were sentenced to life imprisonment with no parole period, so they will die behind bars. As he was being led away, Robert Wagner said, quote, "Pedophiles were doing terrible things to children. The authorities didn't do anything about it. I decided to take action. I took that action. Thank you." I found very little information about the men's time in prison. James Velasquez, now aged 43, is eligible for parole in 2025. Mark Hayden, currently 64 years old, was denied parole in 2017 and again in 2021 and remains behind bars. But his prison term expires in May 2024 and he will automatically be released at this time. With regards to John Bunting, now aged 57 years old, he appears to have accepted that he will spend the rest of his life in prison. Robert Wagner is currently 51 years old and continues to try and gain his freedom. In 2019, a letter was published that he'd written to the Court of Appeal asking for a parole period to be set in his case in order to give him some chance of release. I'll read out the letter, but note the tone and content and the manipulation in Wagner's words. He writes, quote, "I'm a father of a 21-year-old son. I've been in custody since he was 18 months old and would very much like the chance to spend time with him in the community. I believe that by having a non-parole period set, this would greatly assist my mental well-being. Even if the non-parole period was lengthy, just having a date would be beneficial for me. I'm willing to undergo a psych evaluation/assessment should this be required. My behaviour in prison has been reasonably good. I'm currently a circle worker, which is a trusted position. I'm eager to continue with my good behaviour so I can progress through the system. As part of this process, having a non-parole period set would be beneficial. I've done almost 20 years in custody, and I hope that this can be taken into consideration. I pled guilty to 3 counts of murder, which I hope to also be taken into consideration with this request." This bizarre note clearly shows that Robert Wagner does not accept the gravity of his crimes. In a lot of these murders, it seems as though it's difficult to determine who actually ended the victims' lives, but it does appear that Wagner was the one, in the majority of cases, who committed the actual murders. Him using the issue of being a parent to his son is manipulative and ridiculous. In cases where someone commits a serious offence and then bleats about the fact they won't be able to see their children, etc., my response is, well, you didn't think about that at the time, did you? Robert Wagner's son was alive at the time that he murdered David Johnson, so he must have gone home after this and held his son in the same hands that had recently held a saw, which had been used to cut up a man's body. Also, he destroyed families through his actions. Why should he be given special treatment given what he's done? I'm aware that he's not asking for release now, but the fact he thinks he ever deserves to be free again is laughable. The Court of Appeal agreed and rejected Wagner's request, and he remains in prison today, where he belongs. This is a fascinating, horrific and complex case. I mentioned the men involved, but will predominantly focus on John Bunting, the spider at the centre of the web. As a starting point, I think the most important thing in this case is to dispel any notion that the actions of anyone involved was underpinned by anything other than self-interest. Robert Wagner's claim that the group's actions were somehow a response to the police not locking up paedophiles is ridiculous and clearly an attempt to make him and his merry band of murderers seem noble when nothing could be further from the truth. To reinforce this point, it should be noted that UK forensic psychiatrist Kevin Howes, who has worked at Broadmoor Maximum Security Hospital, expressed his opinion that John Bunting was a man who lacked emotion or capacity to empathise with any of his victims, and that he fit the profile of a sadistic psychopath. Specifically, a person who enjoyed the act of torture and murdering others, whilst feeling no remorse for his actions. I think this is spot on, and it's also the underpinning profile of Robert Wagner, and likely Mark Hayden. I don't believe that it relates to James Velasquez, who I'll talk about separately. However, the key thing about these comments is that each man was likely a psychopath. They had no ability to empathize or care about others, and therefore it doesn't correlate that their actions were motivated by concern for anyone else, especially not the welfare of children. The claim about this being about eradicating paedophiles is just not backed up by the evidence. Only one of the victims, Barry Lane, was actually a convicted paedophile. Also, with Barry Lane, if the motivation was eradicating paedophiles, then it seems strange that he'd be allowed to live for around 6 years before his eventual death, especially given that he was, from what I've read, quite a danger to children and more than likely to re-offend. Instead, he was kept alive because it was useful to John Bunting, and murdered to silence him, again a motive to benefit Bunting. Also, whilst 2 others have committed offences against children or suspected of doing so, that's it. So this means for 9 victims, there was no link to paedophilia. So I think you can see Mark Hayden's claim in court is bullshit. Instead, they remain motivated by hate, the love of killing, power and money, and would torture and murder anyone in a heartbeat. In order to understand the real motives, we need to begin by looking at John Bunting, who's at the centre of this case. As already stated, he claimed he was sexually abused when he was a child, and this, he says, occurred when he was 8 years old, and on one occasion. Some research I've read raises some level of scepticism about his claim, with Bunting potentially trying to portray himself as a victim of paedophilia to justify the murders, which, as I've already stated, doesn't stand up to scrutiny. I would tend to agree with this. However, I think more than likely, in line with so many other serial killers, Bunting was subjected to more general abuse, likely acts of violence and neglect in the family home. This led him to grow up without any empathy, remorse or compassion for others, as well as extreme violent tendencies. Potentially this did include the sexual assault he claims, but I think, if it did occur, it compounded the effect of wider issues of abuse linked to his childhood, which are not documented. Bunting's escape from this abuse, again like so many other serial killers, was to wield control over other living things, making himself feel powerful at a time when he likely felt utterly powerless. So he began to torture animals, beginning with insects, but then progressing to killing and skinning cats and dogs. I think that Bunting enjoyed this, and found that he got a sick thrill from having the power of life and death over something living, watching life go out of their eyes, and knowing he had caused that. In terms of his views, I think that primarily John Bunting was homophobic. He despised gay people, and, as with others who hold discriminatory views of homosexuals, he equated this sexual orientation with paedophilia. So to be gay was to be a paedophile, and to be a paedophile meant you were gay. Whether these views were linked to the alleged sexual abuse he suffered is unclear, but more likely it's a reflection of the social situation at the time. During the 1970s and 1980s, the decades Bunting grew up in, the state of Queensland was ruled by the Conservative National Party, headed by John Bellocchi-Peterson. In order to regain re-election, the topic of homophobia was used to spread fear, whilst also linking it to paedophilia. Coupled to this, you had the worldwide AIDS crisis of the 1980s, which resulted in the vilification of homosexuals across the globe. Returning to Queensland, consensual sexual acts between men was only officially decriminalised in 1991, so I think the environment that Bunting grew up in was a key catalyst to his hatred of homosexuals. A person who's homophobic often has other prejudices, as their mindset is inclined to try to elevate their own sense of importance and uniqueness by looking down on other people, and so they'll often look for differences between themselves and others in order to vilify them. So, people who are homophobic often, in my experience, have racist or sexist views, etc. This is where I think Bunting's obsession with Hitler and neo-Nazism is important. Whilst those of the Jewish faith made up the majority of those murdered during the Nazi regime, other categories of so-called undesirables were also exterminated, including the mentally and physically infirm and homosexuals. I think Bunting, given his obsession with this period of history, likely knew this, and this information, coupled with his association with people who likely shared his views, strengthened his hatred of homosexuals, but also allowed him to consider others, including the mentally ill, physically infirm, to be inferior, and therefore perfect to use and abuse, and then exterminate. So you have a man who has no remorse or empathy for others, a tendency towards acts of violence, a desire to wield power over living things, who had an underlying hatred of homosexuals, and an obsession with a regime which eliminated those considered impure on an industrial scale. I think, like others who I've covered who had an admiration for the Nazi regime, John Bunting desired that level of power, not only the ability to eliminate people at will, but also to direct others to do this on his behalf. I've no doubt that Bunting had been having fantasies about killing people, long before his first murder in 1992, and he likely wished to emulate his idol, And in order to match even a small fraction of the horror that characterized the Holocaust, he needed recruits, people who could assist him in acts of violence on the scale that he wanted. Bunting's recruitment methods and his place within the group reminds me of a cult. As I said in a recent video regarding Michael Wayne Ryan, leaders of cults are often psychopathic and motivated by power and control. They recruit followers who are vulnerable for whatever reason and replace that feeling of powerlessness with a sense of purpose which meets their own ends. This was simply an extension of how Bunting operates in his day-to-day life. He targeted those weaker than him, who he could dominate, for example marrying a woman who had the mental age of a child. Using this template, I have no doubt that Bunting had an ability to sniff out vulnerability, to identify people who he could manipulate, and he came across Robert Wagner, a man who, unfortunately, had been abused for years at the hands of Barry Lane, a predatory paedophile, with no one apparently trying to do anything to help him escape. I imagine that Wagner felt extremely angry, abandoned and lost. John Bunting then appears in his life and turns this completely on its head. He is in fact better than these people. They are scum, and if you join me, I'll show you how powerful you can be. Wagner's hatred of paedophiles was, to a great extent, understandable due to the years of abuse he suffered, but it's also likely that he equated homosexuality with paedophilia. However, the abuse he suffered as a child likely meant, as with Bunting, he grew up with no empathy or remorse for his behaviour. Bunting simply nurtured something that was already there. Bunting and Wagner attended neo-Nazi rallies together, and I imagine this was part of Wagner's indoctrination to solidify his hatred of homosexuals, but also to see other types of people in society as being inferior and therefore worthy of abuse and murder. From the account of James Velasquez, it's clear that Bunting would often speak to his followers about his hatred of paedophiles and homosexuals, although in his mind, these were the same things. And I imagine he was a charismatic speaker who would lie and manipulate in order to continually reinforce his doctrine to his followers. One of these people was Mark Hayden, who, again, was a prime target due to his history of abuse. And I think the ability of Bunting to manipulate and brainwash others is shown by the fact that this man not only allowed the group to kill his wife, but when he saw her body, he simply laughed. His behaviour, in my mind, indicates a psychopathic personality, but it may also be that he had extreme cognitive difficulties, having an IQ so low that he could not grasp the seriousness of his situation. I don't have enough information to make a judgment, but it's clear that Mark Hayden was someone Bunting saw as someone he could use for his own ends. Another prime example was James Velasquez, a child who had had a horrific upbringing, who was desperate for love and attention and acceptance of someone who was not going to abuse him. However, John Bunting continued this cycle and turned this child's vulnerability to his advantage, again filling his head with hate so that he would be complicit in the horrors to come. Like everyone else in Bunting's life, James Velasquez was only there to be of use to him. I think the murder of Troy Ude is significant. This was not, in my opinion, born out of any concern for James Velasquez or an act of retribution for his suffering. No, I think that when Bunting heard about Troy abusing Velasquez as a child, he instantly heard homosexual in his head, and therefore he wanted him to die because of his own prejudices, but it was also a test. Troy could easily have been killed without the input of Velasquez, but he was woken and told to come and join in. I think that Bunting, and likely Wagner, wanted to see what Velasquez would do. If he participated, he also had blood on his hands and was one of them. If he did not, he would have been eliminated. Velasquez did participate, but I think, had he not, his name would have been on the list of victims in this case. However, even if the plan had been originally to kill homosexuals, it became clear as time progressed that murder was used to gain access to money, eliminate witnesses, and eliminate those that Bunting considered inferior for any number of reasons, or who simply pissed him off. The issue of money doesn't seem to be highlighted much in what I've read, but I think it is a relevant factor. The group pocketed around 90,000 Australian dollars in benefits payments from their victims, which today is around 170,000 Australian dollars, which is equivalent to about £93,000 or around $115,000. Whilst this may not have been the primary motive of this spree, it seems to have been at the heart of at least one murder, that of Gary O'Dwyer, with James Velasquez being tasked with finding out whether killing him was worth it financially. This again simply shows the complete lack of humanity regarding John Bunting. Everyone in his life was to be used and abused, whether this was to get off on the power of killing them or to line his own pockets. And this is the essence of this group. It was all about John Bunting. I can envisage Bunting imagining himself on a throne as a king, or a god, or a dictator, who, when he had the urge to kill, pointed his finger at someone and ordered their murder, with his minions carrying out his orders without question, This was the most important motivation of all, directing others to do his bidding, as well as the torture and murders themselves, which was something that Bunting enjoyed. It reinforced his sense of power, allowed him to live out his fancies of superiority, him going so far as to get his victims, in their last moments, to essentially grovel at his feet, whilst he looked into their eyes as they took their last breath. His claims about paedophilia and homosexuality, I think predominantly, especially towards the end, simply used to get his followers into a fervour, so they would carry out his orders. No doubt if he hadn't been stopped, the bank vault in Snowtown would have been piled high floor to ceiling with barrels, the output of a production line of murder. However, I think James Velasquez was different. Despite his involvement in this horrifying case, I have a great deal of sympathy for him. His whole life from his childhood to his incarceration was characterised by abuse, going from one predator to another. It doesn't appear from what I've read that Velasquez ever really stood a chance. To be very clear, difficult childhood of any degree does not excuse taking the life of others, but I hope that his full confession, guilty plea, and his acceptance of his punishment are indicators of some level of remorse for his actions, and that, when he's eventually released, he tries to do some good with the rest of his life. This case has taken me ages to research and put together. Remington Harlow, a successful software engineer, and his wife Cordelia, a talented interior designer, were the picture of marital bliss to their friends and neighbors. Their home, with its manicured lawn and white picket fence, stood as a testament to their seemingly perfect life. But beneath the surface, a dark current was stirring. Remington's growing fascination with a taboo fantasy would set in motion a chain of events that would shatter their idyllic existence and end in tragedy. What began as a consensual exploration of desires would spiral into a maelstrom of jealousy, betrayal, and ultimately murder. Remington Harlow was born in 1985 to a middle-class family in Eugene. From an early age, he displayed a keen intellect and a fascination with computers. His parents, both educators, nurtured his interests, and by the time he entered high school, Remington was already coding his own programs. Despite his academic prowess, he struggled socially, often feeling awkward and out of place among his peers. Cordelia Astor, born in 1987, grew up in a wealthy family in Seattle, Washington. The youngest of 3 children, she was vivacious and creative from the start. Her parents, successful real estate developers, provided her with every opportunity, including art classes and interior design courses. Their paths crossed in 2005 at Reed College in Portland. Remington, a junior computer science major, literally bumped into Cordelia, a freshman art student in the campus library. He was immediately smitten by her radiant smile and effortless charm. Cordelia, in turn, found herself drawn to Remington's quiet intensity and brilliant mind. Their courtship was a whirlwind of intellectual discussions, late-night coding sessions, where Cordelia would sketch while Remington typed, and explorations of Portland's eclectic art scene. Despite their different backgrounds and personalities, they found in each other a perfect complement. They married in 2009, shortly after Cordelia's graduation. The wedding, held in a picturesque vineyard in the Willamette Valley, was a joyous affair that seemed to portend a bright future. Remington had already secured a high-paying job at a tech startup in Portland, while Cordelia began to make a name for herself in the city's competitive interior design market. For the first few years of their marriage, life seemed perfect. They bought their dream home in Oak Ridge, traveled the world, and built a wide circle of friends. Remington's career soared as he climbed the corporate ladder, eventually becoming a senior engineer at a tech firm. Cordelia's design business flourished, with her work featured in several magazines. From the outside, the Harlows appeared to have it all: successful careers, a beautiful home, and a strong, loving marriage. But as they entered their 30s, subtle cracks began to form in their seemingly flawless facade, setting the stage for the tumultuous events to come. As the Harlows approached their 10th wedding anniversary, a restlessness began to creep into their relationship. The passion that had once burned so brightly had dimmed to a comfortable, but sometimes monotonous glow. Remington, always introspective, found himself increasingly drawn to online forums and discussions about alternative sexual lifestyles. It started innocently enough, a curiosity about what other couples did to spice up their love lives. But as Remington delved deeper into these virtual communities, he became particularly fascinated by the concept of cuckolding. The idea of watching his wife with another man, of being a voyeur to her pleasure, awakened something within him. At first, Remington kept these thoughts to himself, ashamed and confused by the intensity of his desires. He would stay up late, ostensibly working, but in reality, he was consuming every piece of cuckold-related content he could find. Cordelia, perceptive as ever, sensed the change in her husband. She noticed his distraction, the way his eyes would sometimes glaze over during their conversations, the increased frequency of his late nights at the computer. Concerned, she gently probed, asking if everything was all right if work was becoming too stressful. Finally, after weeks of internal struggle, Remington decided to broach the subject with Cordelia. One evening over a bottle of wine, he haltingly confessed his newfound interest. He spoke of his desires, his curiosity about exploring this fantasy, all the while watching Cordelia's face for signs of disgust or rejection. To his surprise and relief, Cordelia didn't recoil. Instead, she listened with an open mind, asking thoughtful questions about what exactly appealed to him about this scenario. While she expressed initial reservations, she also admitted to a certain intrigue. The idea of being desired by another man, of being the center of attention, held its own allure. This conversation marked a turning point in their marriage. What had been a private fantasy for Remington was now out in the open, a possibility to be explored together. Neither of them could have predicted the profound impact this revelation would have on their lives, or the dangerous path it would ultimately lead them down. The Harlows' foray into the world of cuckolding began cautiously. They set ground rules, discussed boundaries, and agreed to take things slowly. But finding the right person to introduce into their marriage proved challenging. They wanted someone attractive and charismatic, but also discreet and respectful of their arrangement. Enter Thaddeus Blackwood. Cordelia met him at a charity art auction in downtown Portland. Tall, with piercing green eyes, Thaddeus exuded a magnetic charm that drew people to him. As the owner of a successful art gallery, he moved effortlessly through Portland's cultural elite, his wit and knowledge making him the center of attention at any gathering. Cordelia was immediately drawn to Thaddeus's sophisticated aura. They spent the evening in animated conversation about emerging artists and the latest trends in interior design. When Thaddeus casually mentioned being unattached and open to new experiences, Cordelia felt a spark of excitement. She relayed her encounter to Remington that night, watching his eyes light up as she described Thaddeus. They agreed that he might be the perfect candidate for their exploration. Remington encouraged Cordelia to nurture the connection, his excitement palpable. Over the next few weeks, Cordelia and Thaddeus met for coffee several times, ostensibly to discuss potential collaborations between his gallery and her design firm. Each time, Cordelia returned home to regale Remington with stories of their encounters, stoking the flames of his fantasy. Finally, after a particularly flirtatious meeting, Cordelia decided it was time to broach the subject with Thaddeus. To her surprise and delight, he was intrigued by the proposition. He admitted to having participated in similar arrangements before and understood the delicacy required. With Thaddeus on board, the stage was set for the Harlows to turn fantasy into reality. Little did they know that this decision would set in motion a series of events that would irrevocably change their lives. The night of the first encounter arrived with a mix of nervous energy and excited anticipation. Remington and Cordelia had spent weeks planning every detail, from the ambient lighting in their bedroom to the bottle of expensive champagne chilling in an ice bucket. Thaddeus arrived at 8 p.m. sharp, looking dashing in a tailored charcoal suit. He brought with him a bouquet of exotic flowers for Cordelia and a rare bottle of scotch for Remington, a gesture that impressed them both with its thoughtfulness. The evening began in the living room with drinks and light conversation. Thaddeus regaled them with stories from the art world, his charisma on full display. Cordelia, dressed in a slinky black dress, laughed at his jokes and touched his arm with increasing frequency. Remington watched from his armchair, a tumbler of scotch in hand, his heart racing with every interaction between his wife and their guest. As the night progressed and the alcohol flowed, the atmosphere grew charged with sexual tension. Finally, with a meaningful look at Remington, Cordelia took Thaddeus by the hand and led him upstairs. In the bedroom, Remington settled into a corner armchair as Cordelia and Thaddeus began to kiss passionately. When Thaddeus and Cordelia finally fell onto the bed, their bodies entwined, Remington felt a potent mix of arousal and an unexpected twinge of jealousy. The encounter itself was intense and passionate. Remington watched, transfixed, as his fantasy played out before his eyes. The reality was more visceral, more overwhelming than he had imagined. Afterwards, as they all lay spent and silent, Remington felt a complex swirl of emotions. There was satisfaction, certainly. His long-held fantasy had been realized, but there was also a nagging sense of unease, a feeling that something fundamental had shifted. Thaddeus left shortly after, with promises to stay in touch. As Remington and Cordelia lay in bed, discussing the evening's events in hushed, excited tones, neither could have predicted how this first encounter would set the stage for the tragedy to come. They had opened Pandora's box, and there would be no closing it again. Encouraged by the success of their first foray into cuckolding, they eagerly arranged more meetings with Thaddeus. What had started as a monthly indulgence quickly became then weekly. Each encounter seemed to push the boundaries further, with Thaddeus staying longer. The sessions growing more intense and intimate. Remington's role began to evolve as well. Cordelia said in an interview that he was initially content to watch from afar. He found himself drawn closer to the action. Sometimes he would join in, and that the dynamics of power and control within their bedroom became increasingly complex. Outside of their encounters, Thaddeus began to integrate more into their lives. He would join them for dinner, accompany Cordelia to art exhibitions, even spend weekends at their home. His charm and wit made him a delightful companion, and the Harlows found themselves enjoying his company even when action wasn't on the agenda. As spring turned to summer, Remington's initial excitement began to give way to a gnawing sense of discomfort. He started to notice small but significant changes in Cordelia's behavior. She seemed distracted during their alone time, her mind elsewhere. She began to dress up more often, even on days when they had no plans with Thaddeus. One evening, Remington came home early from work to find Cordelia on the phone, speaking in hushed, intimate tones. When she saw him, she quickly ended the call, claiming it was just a client. But Remington couldn't shake the feeling that she had been talking to Thaddeus. In bed, Cordelia's passion seemed to have cooled. She was still enthusiastic during their encounters with Thaddeus, but alone with Remington, she often seemed tired or disinterested. Remington found himself initiating sex more often, only to be gently rebuffed. Remington tried to reassert control over the situation. He suggested taking a break from their arrangement, perhaps going on a vacation, just the two of them. But Cordelia seemed reluctant, always finding reasons to delay or change the subject. His work began to suffer as he spent hours analyzing every interaction, every text message, every glance between Cordelia and Thaddeus. He started checking Cordelia's phone when she wasn't looking, scrutinizing her social media activity, even contemplating following her when she went out alone. Remington knew he was spiraling, but he felt powerless to stop it. The game he had initiated was slipping out of his control, and he was terrified of losing Cordelia. As his anxiety grew, so did his determination to put an end to the situation he had created by any means necessary. The breaking point came on a warm July evening. Remington had planned a romantic dinner at home, hoping to reconnect with Cordelia and discuss his growing concerns. He had left work early, bought her favorite wine, and spent hours preparing an elaborate meal. But as the sun began to set and the candles burned low, Cordelia was nowhere to be seen. Her phone went straight to voicemail. Hours ticked by, the carefully prepared food growing cold on the table. When she finally stumbled in shortly before midnight, her hair disheveled and lipstick smudged, Remington's worst fears seemed confirmed. The argument that ensued was explosive. Remington, his emotions amplified by alcohol and hours of anxious waiting, unleashed all the fears and suspicions he'd been harboring. He accused Cordelia of falling in love with Thaddeus, of making a fool of him, of destroying their marriage. Cordelia, caught off guard and defensive, initially tried to deflect. She claimed she'd lost track of time at a client meeting, that her phone had died. But faced with Remington's relentless questioning and the evidence of her appearance, she finally broke down and admitted she had been with Thaddeus. The confession hit Remington like a physical blow. He had suspected, had feared, but hearing it confirmed shattered something inside him. In that moment, all the excitement and thrill of their arrangement went away. Cordelia, tears streaming down her face, tried to explain. She loved Remington, she insisted, but Thaddeus made her feel alive in a way she hadn't in years. She was confused, torn between her loyalty to her husband and her deepening emotions for Thaddeus. Remington, his voice low and dangerous, demanded that she end things with Thaddeus immediately. Cordelia, her own anger rising, refused. This had been Remington's idea in the first place, she argued. He couldn't dictate her feelings or control her relationships. The argument escalated, with both of them saying hurtful things they would later regret. Remington, in a moment of rage, smashed a wine glass against the wall. Cordelia, shocked by this uncharacteristic display of violence, retreated to the guest bedroom, locking the door behind her. Remington spent the night on the couch, his mind racing, unable to sleep. In the days following their confrontation, a chilling calm settled over the Harlow household. Cordelia and Remington moved around each other like ghosts, barely speaking, the tension palpable. Cordelia spent most of her time out of the house, throwing herself into her work, and Remington suspected meeting with Thaddeus. Remington, for his part, retreated into a dark place within himself. He called in sick to work, spending his days in a haze of alcohol and paranoid thoughts. He scoured Cordelia's computer and phone for evidence of her relationship with Thaddeus, meticulously documenting every text, every call, every unexplained absence. Remington began to fantasize about confronting Thaddeus, about making him pay for destroying his marriage. At first, these were just harmless daydreams, a way to vent his frustration. But as the days wore on and Cordelia grew more distant, these fantasies took on a darker, more violent tone. One afternoon, while Cordelia was at a client meeting, Remington found himself in their garage holding the heavy wrench he used for home repairs. As he felt its weight in his hand, a chilling thought crossed his mind. It should be so easy to end this, and to eliminate the threat to his marriage once and for all. Horrified by the direction of his thoughts, Remington dropped the wrench and fled the garage. But the seed had been planted. As he paced the house, gulping down glasses of whiskey, the idea took root and grew. By the time night fell, what had started as a fleeting, horrifying thought had crystallized into a plan. August 15th dawned hot and humid, the air heavy with the promise of an approaching storm. Remington woke early, his head pounding from another night of heavy drinking, but his resolve unwavering. Today would be the day he confronted Thaddeus, the day he reclaimed control over his life and his marriage. He spent the morning in a feverish state of preparation. He showered, shaved, and dressed with meticulous care as if preparing for an important business meeting rather than the violent confrontation he was planning. In the garage, he selected the wrench he had held days earlier, wrapping it in a towel and placing it in a nondescript gym bag. Cordelia left for work around 9 a.m., barely acknowledging Remington as she rushed out the door. As soon as she was gone, Remington got into his car and drove to Thaddeus's gallery. He parked across the street, watching as Thaddeus arrived, greeting his employees with his characteristic charm. For hours, Remington sat in his car. As closing time approached, Remington watched Thaddeus bid goodbye to his last customer and begin closing up the gallery. This was the moment he had been waiting for. With shaking hands, he grabbed the gym bag and crossed the street. Thaddeus was locking the gallery door when Remington approached. He turned, surprise flickering across his face before it settled into a wary smile. "Remington," he said, "this is unexpected. Is everything all right?" Remington felt a surge of rage at Thaddeus's casual tone, as if he hadn't been destroying Remington's life for months. Without conscious thought, he swung the gym bag, catching Thaddeus off guard and sending him stumbling back against the gallery door. What followed was a blur of violence and desperation. Remington pulled out the wrench, swinging it wildly as Thaddeus tried to defend himself, but Remington was beyond reason. Every blow was fueled by months of jealousy, insecurity, and rage. When it was over, Remington stood panting over Thaddeus's motionless body, the wrench slick with blood in his trembling hand. The reality of what he had done crashed over him like a tidal wave. He had just killed a man. He had just destroyed his own life in a futile attempt to save it. Remington went through the motions of covering his tracks. He dragged Thaddeus's body into the alley behind the gallery, hiding it behind a dumpster. He wiped down the door handle and any surfaces he might have touched. Then, still in a state of shock, he drove home, the weight of his actions settling over him like a shroud. The storm that had been threatening all day finally broke as Remington pulled into his driveway, the rain washing away the blood on his hands, but doing nothing to cleanse his conscience. The hours following the murder passed in a nightmarish blur for Remington. He stumbled into the house, barely making it to the bathroom before violently emptying the contents of his stomach. As the adrenaline wore off, the full impact of his actions hit him. He had killed a man. He was a murderer. Operating on autopilot, Remington set about destroying evidence. He burned his clothes in the backyard fire pit, scrubbed the car clean, and took a shower. When Cordelia came home, Remington had composed himself enough to feign normalcy. He greeted her with forced cheerfulness, suggesting they order takeout and watch a movie. As they sat on the couch, the TV flickering unwatched, Remington's mind raced. He knew it was only a matter of time before Thaddeus's body was discovered. He needed an alibi, a story to tell when the inevitable questions came. He casually mentioned to Cordelia that he had spent the day at home catching up on work and doing some yard work. He even showed her a small cut on his hand, claiming he had nicked himself while pruning the rose bushes, a cut that had actually come from his struggle with Thaddeus. 2 days after the murder, the news broke. Thaddeus Blackwood, prominent art dealer and fixture of Portland's cultural scene, had been found dead behind his shop. The police were treating it as a homicide. Remington learned of the discovery while at work, overhearing colleagues discussing the shocking news. He felt the blood drain from his face, his hands shaking so badly he had to excuse himself to the restroom. The investigation moved quickly. Detective Eliana Rossi, a veteran of the Police Bureau's Homicide Division, took charge of the case. She and her team combed through Thaddeus's life, interviewing friends, family, and business associates. It didn't take long for them to uncover Thaddeus's relationship with the Harlows. Cordelia, devastated by the news of Thaddeus's death, initially tried to downplay their connection, but faced with evidence from Thaddeus's phone records and witness accounts, she eventually admitted to their affair. When the police came to interview Remington, he was prepared. He expressed shock and sadness at Thaddeus's death, acknowledging that while their arrangement had been unconventional, he had considered Thaddeus a friend. He calmly recounted his movements on the day of the murder, his story aligning perfectly with what he had told Cordelia. Detective Rossi, however, sensed something off about Remington's demeanor. His calm seemed forced, his grief a touch too performative. She made a mental note to dig deeper into his background and movements. As the investigation progressed, the police began to piece together a timeline of Thaddeus's last day. Security footage from nearby businesses showed him entering the gallery in the morning but never leaving. His last phone call had been to Cordelia, ending abruptly around closing time. The net was slowly closing around Remington. As the days turned into weeks, Cordelia's grief over Thaddeus's death deepened. She threw herself into her work, often staying late at the office, avoiding the stilted silences that now characterized her home life with Remington. At first, Remington's attentiveness in the wake of the tragedy had touched her. He seemed genuinely concerned for her well-being, always ready with a comforting word or a shoulder to cry on. But as time passed, she began to notice inconsistencies in his behavior. Cordelia found herself revisiting the events leading up to Thaddeus's death. She remembered Remington's jealousy, his desperate pleas for her to end the affair. The more she thought about it, the more a terrible suspicion began to take root in her mind. She started paying closer attention to Remington's actions, noting when he left the house, checking his browser history when he wasn't around. She even considered hiring a private investigator, but couldn't bring herself to take that final step. As her suspicions grew, so did her fear. If Remington was capable of what she was beginning to suspect, what else might he be capable of? For the first time in their marriage, Cordelia found herself afraid of her husband, unsure of the man she had promised to love for better or worse. The breakthrough in the case came from an unexpected source. A homeless man, known to frequent the alley behind Thaddeus's gallery, came forward with information. He claimed to have seen a man matching Remington's description entering the alley on the night of the murder, carrying a gym bag. This new lead energized the investigation. Detective Rossi and her team began to scrutinize Remington's movements more closely. They discovered traffic camera footage that contradicted his alibi, showing his car near the gallery around the time of the murder. As the evidence mounted, Remington's behavior became increasingly erratic. He started drinking heavily, snapping at colleagues, and becoming paranoid about being followed. Cordelia, her own suspicions now seeming confirmed, began to distance herself from him, staying with a friend under the guise of needing space to grieve. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when the police, armed with a search warrant, found small traces of blood in Remington's car that matched Thaddeus's DNA. They also discovered the murder weapon, the blood-stained wrench that Remington had hidden in the attic, unable to bring himself to dispose of it completely. On a rainy September morning, nearly a month after Thaddeus's death, Detective Rossi arrived at the Harlow residence with a team of officers. They found Remington sitting in the living room, a half-empty bottle of whiskey beside him. As the detective read him his rights, Remington offered no resistance. In that moment, he felt an odd sense of relief. The game was over. The lies, the fear, the constant vigilance. It could all stop now. Remington Harlow's trial was brief but sensational. He pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, his confession a rambling account of jealousy, fantasy, and fatal obsession. He was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. Cordelia, shattered by the revelation of her husband's actions, filed for divorce shortly after his arrest. She sold their house, unable to live with the memories it held, and moved out of state to start a new life. The year was 2018, and what began as a seemingly ordinary romance between two young adults would spiral into a nightmare that no one could have foreseen. Michelle Marsters, a 26-year-old aspiring writer with a troubled past, and Jake Brendan, a 28-year-old software engineer from a close-knit family, were an unlikely pair. Their whirlwind romance captivated their friends and family at first, but as time went on, those closest to them began to sense that something was amiss. Michelle Marsters' childhood was a tapestry of instability and emotional turmoil. Born to a single mother who struggled with substance abuse, Michelle spent her formative years bouncing between relatives' homes and foster care. The constant upheaval left deep scars on her psyche, manifesting in an intense fear of abandonment and a desperate need for control in her relationships. As a teenager, Michelle found solace in writing, pouring her pain and longing onto the pages of countless journals. Her talent for crafting vivid narratives earned her a scholarship to a local community college, where she excelled in creative writing courses. However, her personal life remained tumultuous, marked by a series of volatile relationships that always seemed to end in heartbreak and betrayal. Jake Brendan, on the other hand, grew up in a warm and loving household. The middle child of three, Jake was raised by parents who prioritized family bonds and open communication. Family dinners were a nightly occurrence in the Brendan home, and weekends were often spent on camping trips or gathered around board games. This nurturing environment fostered Jake's natural inclination towards kindness and his strong sense of loyalty to those he loved. Academically gifted, Jake breezed through school and earned a full ride to a prestigious university where he studied computer science. His easygoing nature and quick wit made him popular among his peers, and he maintained a close circle of friends from high school through his college years. Michelle and Jake's paths crossed at a local coffee shop. Michelle, hunched over her laptop, was startled when Jake accidentally bumped into her table, nearly spilling her latte. Flustered, Jake insisted on buying her a new drink, and what started as an awkward encounter quickly blossomed into an engaging conversation about literature, technology, and their shared love of obscure indie films. Drawn to Jake's warmth and stability, Michelle found herself opening up in a way she never had before. Jake, in turn, was captivated by Michelle's passion for storytelling and her apparent vulnerability. They exchanged numbers that night, and within weeks they were practically inseparable. The early days of their relationship were a whirlwind of romantic gestures and shared adventures. Michelle introduced Jake to the world of local poetry slams and art galleries, while Jake taught Michelle the basics of coding and took her on hikes to his favorite scenic spots. To their friends, they seemed like the perfect couple, Jake's calm demeanor perfectly complementing Michelle's creative energy. However, as the honeymoon phase began to wane, subtle cracks started to appear in their idyllic romance. Michelle's need for constant reassurance and her discomfort with Jake's close relationships with his family and friends began to surface. What Jake initially perceived as endearing clinginess slowly morphed into something more sinister. As Michelle and Jake's relationship progressed past the 6-month mark, the initial euphoria of new love began to give way to a more complex and troubling dynamic. Michelle's past traumas and abandonment issues, long simmering beneath the surface, started to manifest in increasingly problematic ways. It started subtly at first, Michelle would text Jake incessantly throughout the day, growing anxious and irritable if he didn't respond promptly. She began to question his whereabouts when they weren't together, often asking for photographic evidence of his location. Jake, attributing this behavior to Michelle's deep affection for him, initially found it endearing and did his best to accommodate her needs. However, Michelle's demands for Jake's time and attention soon began to escalate. She would grow visibly upset when Jake made plans with his friends or family, often guilt-tripping him into canceling to spend time with her instead. Jake's best friend since childhood, Michael, was the first to voice his concerns. During a rare guys' night out, Michael confronted Jake about his increasing absence from their social circle. "Jake, you've barely hung out with us in months. What's going on, man? Is everything okay with you and Michelle?" Jake brushed off Michael's worries, insisting that he was just busy and that everything was fine. But deep down, a seed of unease had been planted. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right in his relationship with Michelle. As weeks turned into months, Michelle's behavior became increasingly erratic and controlling. She began to monitor Jake's social media accounts, questioning him about every female interaction, no matter how innocuous. She insisted on knowing his phone password and would often scroll through his messages while he slept. Jake's family, once warmly welcoming of Michelle, started to grow wary of her influence on their son and brother. Sarah Brendan, Jake's mother, was particularly concerned. She noticed how Jake had become withdrawn and less communicative, a stark contrast to the open and affectionate son she had raised. During a family dinner that Michelle reluctantly attended, tensions came to a head. When Sarah innocently asked Jake about his plans to attend his cousin's upcoming wedding, Michelle interjected before he could respond. "We're actually thinking of taking a trip that weekend, aren't we, Jake?" she said, her voice sickly sweet but her eyes flashing with warning. Jake, caught off guard, stumbled through a non-committal response, much to his family's visible dismay. After dinner, Sarah pulled her son aside, her voice low and urgent. "Jake, honey, I'm worried about you. This isn't like you missing family events, barely calling. Is everything all right with Michelle?" Michelle, overhearing the exchange, flew into a rage on the drive home. She accused Jake of allowing his family to come between them, twisting the situation to paint herself as the victim. "Your mother hates me, Jake. She's trying to poison you against me. Can't you see that?" Torn between his love for Michelle and his deep-rooted family ties, Jake found himself walking an increasingly precarious tightrope. He began to make excuses to his family and friends, gradually withdrawing from social engagements and family gatherings to keep the peace with Michelle. As Jake's world shrank to revolve almost entirely around Michelle, her paranoia and possessiveness only intensified. She began to see threats to their relationship everywhere, in Jake's co-workers, in casual interactions with strangers, and especially in his family's attempts to maintain a connection with him. As Michelle's grip on Jake's life tightened, a part of him began to resist. The values instilled by his upbringing, the importance of family, the strength of long-standing friendships started to reassert themselves. This internal conflict came to a head on a chilly November evening, nearly a year into their relationship. Jake received a call from his sister, Lauren, informing him that their father had been hospitalized with a suspected heart attack. Without hesitation, Jake grabbed his keys, ready to rush to the hospital. Michelle, however, had other ideas. "Jake, you can't go," she pleaded. "We were supposed to have dinner together. You promised." Jake, torn between his worry for his father and his fear of upsetting Michelle, tried to reason with her. Michelle's face contorted with rage. "Your family again," she spat. "They're always trying to take you away from me. If you leave now, don't bother coming back." For the first time, Jake saw through the haze of manipulation. The absurdity of Michelle's demand in the face of a family emergency snapped something inside him. Without another word, he walked out the door, leaving Michelle screaming behind him. At the hospital, surrounded by the warmth and support of his family, Jake felt as if he was waking from a long, confusing dream. His father's condition, thankfully, turned out to be less serious than initially feared. As Jake sat in the waiting room, his mother gently broached the subject they had all been avoiding. Jake, his defenses weakened by the night's events, finally opened up. He shared with his mother the extent of Michelle's controlling behavior, her jealousy, and her attempts to isolate him. Sarah listened, her heart breaking for her son, but also relieved that he was finally seeing the truth. Over the next few days, as his father recovered, Jake spent more time with his family. He reconnected with friends he had neglected, realizing how much he had missed their company.
Michelle's incessant calls and messages went unanswered as Jake took time to reflect on their relationship. When Jake finally returned to the apartment he shared with Michelle, he was resolved to end things. Michelle, however, sensed the shift in Jake's demeanor and launched into a preemptive attack. "It's your mother, isn't it? She's turned you against me. I knew she hated me." Michelle's words devolved into a torrent of abuse aimed at Jake's family, particularly his mother. "Jake, I can't do this anymore. I won't cut my family out of my life for you or anyone else." As Jake turned to leave, Michelle's face twisted into a mask of pure hatred. Jake left, shaken but determined, unaware of the chilling prophecy contained in Michelle's parting words. The events of March 15, 2019 would forever be etched in the memories of Queenstown's residents. It began as an ordinary Friday, people hurrying to work, children boarding school buses, the usual rhythm of small-town life in full swing. For Sarah Brendan, it started as a day like any other, filled with routine tasks and errands. Sarah had just returned home from her morning yoga class, her mind preoccupied with plans for the weekend. Jake had promised to come over for a family dinner on Sunday, the first in months, and Sarah was determined to make it special. As she pulled into her driveway, she noticed an unfamiliar car parked across the street, but thought nothing of it. Humming softly, Sarah unlocked her front door and stepped inside, her arms laden with groceries. She didn't notice the shadow that detached itself from the side of the house and silently followed her in. Michelle Marsters, her eyes wild with a manic gleam, had been waiting for hours. In her delusional state, she had convinced herself that Sarah was the root of all her problems. Remove Sarah, she thought, and Jake would be hers completely. As Sarah bent to set her bags on the kitchen counter, Michelle struck. With a guttural cry of rage, she brought a heavy cast-iron skillet, grabbed from Sarah's own kitchen, crashing down on the woman's head. Sarah crumpled to the floor, dazed and disoriented. Blood trickled from a gash on her scalp. Michelle, consumed by her frenzy, didn't stop. She brought the skillet down again and again, Sarah's weak attempts at self-defense growing feebler with each blow. When it was over, Michelle stood panting over Sarah's motionless form. Blood spattered her clothes and face. In Michelle's twisted mind, she had done what was necessary. She had eliminated the threat to her relationship with Jake. Now, she reasoned, he would have no choice but to turn to her for comfort and support. With a clinical detachment that would later disturb even seasoned investigators, Michelle set about staging the scene. She ransacked the house, overturning furniture and emptying drawers, creating the illusion of a robbery gone wrong. She pocketed Sarah's jewelry and cash, planning to dispose of them later. In the bathroom, Michelle scrubbed the blood from her skin and changed into clean clothes she had brought with her. She wrapped her stained garments and the skillet in a plastic bag, intending to discard them far from the scene. As a final touch, Michelle used Sarah's own phone to send a text to Jake. "Looking forward to Sunday dinner, sweetheart. Love you." It was a chilling detail that would later send shivers down the spines of those involved in the case. Confident that she had covered her tracks, Michelle left the Brendan home as quietly as she had entered. To any passers-by, she would have looked like any other young woman going about her day, not someone who had just committed a brutal murder. Michelle drove to a remote area outside of town, where she burned her bloodied clothes and tossed the skillet into a deep pond. Returning to her apartment, Michelle began to craft her alibi. She called a friend, chatting normally about weekend plans. She posted on social media, careful to establish a timeline that placed her far from the Brendan home at the time of the murder. Then she waited. Hours passed, and as the sun began to set, Michelle's phone rang. It was Jake, his voice cracking with emotion. "Michelle," he sobbed, "something terrible has happened. It's my mom, she's dead." Michelle's performance was Oscar-worthy. She gasped in shock, her voice filled with false concern and sympathy. "Oh my God, Jake, what happened? Are you okay? Where are you? I'm coming right over." Everything was going according to plan. Soon, she thought, Jake would be utterly dependent on her. The discovery of Sarah Brendan's body sent shockwaves through the quiet community. Jake, worried when his mother didn't answer his calls about Sunday dinner, had driven to her house to check on her. The scene that greeted him would haunt him for years to come. Detective Lisa Martinez, a veteran of the police department, took charge of the investigation. From the moment she stepped into the Brendan home, something about the scene didn't sit right with her. While it appeared to be a robbery gone wrong, certain details nagged at her experienced instincts. The house had been ransacked, true, but in a way that seemed almost methodical, rather than the chaotic ransacking typical of a panicked burglar. Valuable electronics were left untouched, while jewelry and cash were missing. Most tellingly, there were no signs of forced entry. As the forensics team combed through the house, Detective Martinez began the painful process of interviewing the family. Jake, still in shock, could barely string together coherent sentences. His father, recently released from the hospital, was devastated and confused. It was Jake's sister Lauren who provided the first piece of the puzzle that would ultimately lead to Michelle. Detective Lauren said, "I don't know if this is important, but Jake's girlfriend, Michelle, she's been acting really strange lately. She seemed obsessed with Jake, always trying to keep him away from us." Martinez's interest was piqued. She gently probed for more information, and Lauren opened up about the gradual isolation Jake had experienced, the tension between Michelle and their mother, and the recent confrontation that had led to Jake spending more time with his family. The detective's suspicions grew as she interviewed Jake's friends and coworkers. A picture began to emerge of Michelle as a controlling, paranoid partner who had systematically attempted to cut Jake off from his support network. However, suspicion was not proof, and Martinez knew she needed hard evidence. Forensics provided the next breakthrough. Despite the killer's efforts to clean up, trace amounts of blood were found in areas inconsistent with the location of Sarah's body. DNA analysis would later confirm it was a mix of Sarah's blood and the killer's. Moreover, fibers found on Sarah's clothing didn't match anything in her home. Martinez's team began the painstaking process of checking traffic cameras and interviewing neighbors. One elderly woman recalled seeing a car similar to Michelle's parked on the street the morning of the murder, but couldn't be certain. As the investigation progressed, Martinez brought Michelle in for questioning. Michelle arrived at the station projecting an image of concern and cooperation, but the detective's trained eye noted the subtle signs of anxiety, the slight tremor in her hands, the occasional darting of her eyes. "Michelle," Martinez began, her tone casual, "can you tell me where you were on the morning of March 15th? Michelle's response was smooth, rehearsed. She claimed to have been at a local cafe, working on her latest writing project. She even produced a receipt as proof, but something about her story didn't add up. Martinez decided to take a risk. "Michelle," she said, leaning forward, "we have a witness who saw your car near the Brendan home on the morning of the murder. Want to revise your statement?" Michelle's composure cracked for just a moment, a flash of panic in her eyes, a slight hitch in her breathing. She quickly recovered, vehemently denying the accusation, but Martinez had seen enough. The investigation was far from over, but Martinez felt they were on the right track. Little did she know that the case was about to break wide open, thanks to an unexpected source, Jake himself. In the days following his mother's murder, Jake Brendan found himself in a fog of grief and confusion. Michelle was a constant presence, offering comfort and support. As the initial shock began to wear off, Jake started to notice inconsistencies in Michelle's behavior that gnawed at him. It was a small thing that first aroused his suspicions. While looking for a photo of his mother for the funeral service, Jake came across Michelle's journal. Normally, he would have respected her privacy, but a nagging feeling prompted him to open it. What he found chilled him to the bone. Page after page was filled with increasingly paranoid and violent rants about his mother. "Sarah's trying to turn him against me. She has to be stopped. I'm the only one who truly loves him." The last entry, dated the day before the murder, read simply, "Tomorrow I'll fix everything." He wanted to dismiss the idea, but too many pieces were falling into place. Michelle's obsessive behavior, her hatred of his mother, her insistence on being with him constantly since the murder. Torn between his loyalty to Michelle and his growing suspicions, Jake decided to confide in Detective Martinez. He brought the journal to the police station, his hands shaking as he handed it over. "I think Michelle might have had something to do with my mom's death." Martinez's team quickly obtained a warrant to search Michelle and Jake's apartment. Hidden in the back of a closet, they found a bag containing Sarah's missing jewelry. In a stroke of luck, the pond where Michelle had disposed of the murder weapon had been partially drained for maintenance, revealing the blood-stained skillet. As the evidence mounted, Michelle's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. Her alibi fell apart under scrutiny. The cafe receipt she had produced was for a different day, and security footage showed her car leaving town in the direction of the Brendan home on the morning of the murder. Jake, grappling with the betrayal and the horrifying realization of what Michelle had done, agreed to cooperate with the police. In a recorded phone call, he confronted Michelle about his suspicions. Caught off guard, Michelle's responses were incriminating. "Why did you do it, Michelle? I loved you."
Michelle's response was chilling in its delusion. "I did it for us, Jake," she said, her voice eerily calm. "Your mother was trying to keep us apart. Now we can be together forever. Don't you see? It was the only way." With this final piece of evidence, Detective Martinez moved to make an arrest. The stage was set for Michelle's arrest, but even Martinez couldn't have predicted the dramatic turn of events that would unfold as they moved to take her into custody. Michelle, unaware that her world was about to come crashing down, was inside a bookstore. Martinez had decided on a public arrest to minimize the risk of Michelle doing something desperate. As Michelle exited the store, two plainclothes officers approached her casually. "Michelle Marsters?" One of them said. "We need you to come with us." For a moment, Michelle froze, her eyes darting around like a cornered animal. Then, in a burst of panic, she turned and ran. She made it only a few steps before Martinez tackled her to the ground. As the detective handcuffed her, Michelle began to scream. "You don't understand. I did it for love. Jake needs me." At the police station, Michelle was led to an interrogation room where Martinez was waiting. For hours, Michelle maintained her innocence, her story becoming increasingly convoluted as she tried to explain away the evidence. Martinez watched patiently, waiting for the right moment to break through Michelle's defenses. Finally, as exhaustion and the weight of her lies began to take their toll, Martinez played her trump card. She placed Jake's journal in front of Michelle. "Jake found your journal. He knows what you did." The effect was immediate. Michelle's face crumpled, tears streaming down her cheeks. "He wasn't supposed to find out," she whispered. "It was supposed to be our fresh start." What followed was a chilling confession that left even the seasoned detective shaken. Michelle described in vivid detail how she had planned and carried out Sarah's murder, her voice devoid of remorse as she recounted the brutal attack. "I had to do it," Michelle insisted, her eyes fever bright. "Sarah was poisoning Jake against me. She never understood our love. With her gone, Jake would need me. We would be together forever." When the confession was complete, Michelle seemed to deflate, the reality of her situation finally sinking in. "What's going to happen to me?" she asked, suddenly sounding very young and afraid. The prosecutor presented a methodical, airtight case. She walked the jury through the evidence. The DNA found at the crime scene, the murder weapon recovered from the pond, the damning entries in Michelle's journal, and finally, Michelle's own recorded confession. Perhaps the most powerful moment of the prosecution's case came when Jake took the stand. His testimony was heart-wrenching, detailing the gradual isolation he experienced and his growing unease with Michelle's behavior. The defense faced an uphill battle. Given the overwhelming evidence, Stevenson opted for a mental health defense, arguing that Michelle's troubled background and psychological issues had left her incapable of distinguishing right from wrong. Psychiatrists took the stand, offering conflicting opinions on Michelle's mental state. Dr. Samantha Wright, testifying for the defense, diagnosed Michelle with borderline personality disorder and argued that her extreme fear of abandonment had driven her to commit the murder. Throughout the trial, Michelle sat at the defense table, often appearing detached from the proceedings. After a week-long trial, the jury retired to deliberate. They returned after just 6 hours with a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. As the verdict was read, Michelle finally broke her eerie calm, collapsing in sobs. Michelle Marsters, sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, retreated into a world of fantasy behind bars. She continued to write, filling notebooks with stories of star-crossed lovers and tragic romances, unable or unwilling to fully grasp the reality of her crimes. For the residents of Queenstown, the case served as a chilling reminder that sometimes the greatest dangers come from where we least expect them. It was a tragedy that would be remembered for years to come, a cautionary tale about the dark side of love and the devastating consequences of unchecked obsession. Emmett Dalton grew up the youngest of 3 siblings. His family owned a small hardware store, which had been in the Dalton family for generations. Emmett was always known as the gentle soul of the family, with a kind word for everyone and a willingness to help anyone in need. He had a close relationship with his parents, who cherished his thoughtful and considerate nature. In school, Emmett was not the most popular kid, but he was well-liked for his easygoing attitude and warm smile. He had a small circle of friends who appreciated his loyalty and sense of humor. After graduating high school,
Emmett decided to stay in their home to help his parents run the hardware store. He enjoyed the simple life and found contentment in the routine of small-town living. Emmett's relationship with his family was solid. His older siblings had moved to nearby cities but frequently visited, maintaining a strong bond with their youngest brother. Emmett was particularly close to his sister Rachel, who often confided in him and sought his advice. His parents, though traditional in their ways, were supportive of Emmett and proud of the man he had become. Emmett had a few relationships, none of which were particularly serious. He was looking for someone who shared his values and appreciated the quiet life he enjoyed. Lila Renshaw was a strikingly beautiful woman with an air of mystery that captivated those around her. She grew up in the bustling city of Larkspur, a stark contrast to the quiet town. Lila's upbringing was far from idyllic. Her parents had a hard relationship, marked by frequent arguments and bouts of separation. As an only child, Lila often found herself caught in the middle of their conflicts, learning early on how to manipulate situations to her advantage. In her teenage years, Lila developed a reputation for being headstrong and manipulative. She had a string of relationships, each ending in turmoil due to her controlling nature. Lila thrived on power and control, often pushing her partners to the brink with her demanding and possessive behavior. Despite this, her charm and allure made it difficult for people to see her true nature until it was too late. After finishing high school, Lila moved to town in search of a fresh start. She quickly found a job at a local boutique, where her charisma and sales skills made her a favorite among customers. It was here that she met Emmett Dalton, a regular customer who was immediately taken by her beauty and confidence. To Lila, Emmett seemed like the perfect target, a kind, gentle man who was easy to control. Lila's past relationships had always followed a similar pattern. She would charm her way into her partner's life, gradually isolating them from their friends and family. Once she had established control, her true colors would show, leading to intense arguments and emotional manipulation. Her partners often felt trapped, unable to leave due to Lila's relentless grip on their lives. When Lila met Emmett, she saw him as another challenge, someone she could mold and control. She was drawn to his kindness and vulnerability, seeing them as weaknesses she could exploit. Emmett's trusting nature made it easy for Lila to weave her way into his life, slowly isolating him from those who cared about him. To the outside world, Lila and Emmett appeared to be a happy couple, but behind closed doors, a much darker story was unfolding. Emmett first met Lila on a warm summer afternoon at the local boutique. He was shopping for a birthday gift for his mother when Lila, with her striking looks and confident demeanor, offered to help him. Their interaction was brief, but left a lasting impression on Emmett. He couldn't stop thinking about her radiant smile and the way she seemed genuinely interested in helping him. A few days later, Emmett returned to the boutique, this time with the intention of asking Lila out. To his delight, she accepted, and they arranged to meet for coffee at a quaint cafe in town. Their first date was filled with laughter and easy conversation. Lila was charming and attentive, asking Emmett about his life, his family, and his dreams. Emmett felt an immediate connection, believing he had finally found someone who truly understood him. As their relationship progressed, Emmett's friends and family noticed how happy he seemed. Lila often joined him at family gatherings and social events, quickly becoming a familiar face in the community. She seemed to fit right in, and Emmett's parents were pleased to see their son so content. However, there were subtle changes in Emmett that only those closest to him noticed. Lila's charm had a way of overshadowing her more manipulative tendencies. She began to subtly influence Emmett's decisions, steering him away from activities and people she deemed unnecessary. At first, it was small things, like suggesting they spend more time alone together or questioning the motives of his friends. Emmett, eager to please Lila and maintain the harmony of their relationship, often acquiesced to her demands. Lila was meticulous in her approach. She never directly forbade Emmett from seeing his friends or family, but she planted seeds of doubt in his mind. She would mention how certain friends didn't seem to appreciate him, or how his family was overly critical. Emmett, who had always been sensitive to others' opinions, began to internalize these suggestions, gradually distancing himself from his loved ones. Despite these changes, Emmett remained convinced that Lila was the best thing that had ever happened to him. He admired her confidence and believed that she had his best interests at heart. Lila, on the other hand, was pleased with how easily she had managed to isolate Emmett. She felt a sense of power knowing that she was the center of his world. controlling his actions and decisions. Their relationship continued to deepen, with Emmett becoming more dependent on Lila for emotional support and validation. Lila, aware of her influence, began to tighten her grip, ensuring that Emmett had little to no contact with anyone outside their relationship. To the outside world, they appeared to be a perfect couple, but behind closed doors, the dynamics were far more sinister. Emmett's once vibrant social life dwindled to nothing, leaving him isolated and completely under Lila's control. As the months passed, Lila's control over Emmett grew stronger. She employed subtle yet effective methods to isolate him from his family and friends, ensuring that he remained entirely dependent on her. It started with casual suggestions and offhand comments, but gradually, her tactics became more manipulative and deliberate. One evening, as Emmett prepared to meet his sister Rachel for dinner, Lila expressed concern about his family's influence on him. She mentioned how they always seemed to criticize their relationship and hinted that perhaps they didn't truly want him to be happy. Emmett, already sensitive to his family's opinions, began to doubt their intentions. He canceled the dinner, opting instead to stay home with Lila. Lila also made it a point to be present whenever Emmett received phone calls from friends or family. She would sit close by, making him uncomfortable and self-conscious about the conversation. Over time, Emmett's calls to his loved ones became less frequent as he grew tired of the tension it caused. His friends noticed his absence from social gatherings and reached out, but Lila always found a way to intercept their messages or make excuses for why Emmett couldn't attend. Lila's control extended to Emmett's daily routines and activities. She insisted on accompanying him everywhere, from grocery shopping to his volunteer work at the local community center. Emmett, eager to keep the peace, didn't resist. He began to feel suffocated, but he couldn't pinpoint the source of his discomfort. Lila's constant presence and influence made it difficult for him to think clearly or make decisions independently. One particularly telling incident occurred when Emmett's childhood friend, Leo, invited him on a weekend fishing trip. Emmett, excited about the prospect of reconnecting with Leo, shared the news with Lila. Her reaction was swift and intense. She questioned Leo's motives, suggesting that he was trying to pull Emmett away from their relationship. Lila accused Emmett of being inconsiderate, claiming that he was abandoning her for a frivolous outing. Emmett, caught off guard by her emotional outburst, reluctantly declined Leo's invitation. Lila's manipulation didn't stop there. She began to control Emmett's finances, convincing him to merge their bank accounts for convenience. This move further isolated Emmett, as he now had limited access to his own money. Lila monitored his spending closely, questioning every purchase and often overriding his decisions. Emmett felt increasingly powerless, unable to assert himself without facing Lila's wrath. Despite these red flags, Emmett continued to believe that Lila had his best interests at heart. He rationalized her behavior as a sign of her deep love and commitment to their relationship. However, the isolation took a toll on his mental and emotional well-being. He became withdrawn and anxious, struggling to reconcile his love for Lila with the growing sense of entrapment. Lila, sensing Emmett's inner turmoil, doubled down on her efforts to isolate him. She discouraged him from seeking help or confiding in others, framing it as a betrayal of their trust. Emmett, already emotionally fragile, complied. He cut off contact with the few remaining friends and family members he had left, fully entrusting his life to Lila's control. As the months turned into a year, Emmett's world became smaller and more confined. His once vibrant and fulfilling life was reduced to the narrow confines of his relationship with Lila. The community, unaware of the turmoil behind closed doors, continued to see them as a happy couple. Despite Lila's control, there were moments when he longed for the comfort and support of his family and friends. These flickers of desire for connection were met with resistance from Lila, who sensed that she was losing her grip on him. One afternoon, Emmett found himself standing outside the hardware store, reminiscing about the days when he would work alongside his father. He missed the camaraderie of the small community and the simple joys of his previous life. On an impulse, he decided to visit his parents, hoping for a moment of normalcy and perhaps a chance to explain his absence. When Emmett arrived at his parents' house, they were overjoyed to see him. His mother, Eleanor, embraced him tightly, her eyes filled with concern. His father, Thomas, greeted him with a firm handshake, his expression a mix of relief and worry. Emmett felt a surge of emotion as he sat down with his parents, who eagerly caught him up on family news and events. For a brief moment, Emmett felt like himself again, surrounded by the warmth and familiarity of his family. However, as the visit progressed, he could sense Lila's disapproval hanging over him like a dark cloud. She had called him multiple times during the visit, each call more insistent than the last. Emmett's parents noticed his unease and gently probed, asking if everything was all right. Emmett hesitated, but eventually confided in his parents about the strain he was feeling. He didn't go into detail about Lila's manipulative behavior, but he mentioned feeling overwhelmed and isolated. Eleanor and Thomas listened attentively, offering their support and urging Emmett to reach out more often. They assured him that he was always welcome and that they would help him in any way they could. Leaving his parents' house that day, Emmett felt a glimmer of hope. He resolved to reconnect with his family and friends, believing that their support would help him regain a sense of normalcy. However, when he returned home, Lila was waiting for him, her eyes cold and calculating. Lila's anger was palpable. She accused Emmett of betraying her trust and undermining their relationship. She framed his visit to his parents as a deliberate attempt to distance himself from her. Emmett, caught off guard by her intensity, tried to explain that he simply missed his family and needed their support. But Lila wouldn't hear of it. She berated him, using emotional manipulation to make him feel guilty and ashamed. The following days were a nightmare for Emmett. Lila's controlling behavior escalated, and she became more possessive and paranoid. She monitored his every move, checking his phone and questioning his whereabouts. Emmett felt trapped, unable to breathe under the suffocating weight of her control. Despite Lila's efforts, Emmett managed to reach out to his sister Rachel through discreet messages. Rachel, sensing her brother's distress, agreed to meet him in secret. They met at a secluded park, where Emmett poured out his heart, revealing the extent of Lila's manipulation and control. Rachel was horrified and immediately offered her support, vowing to help Emmett break free from Lila's grasp. Emmett's attempts to reconnect with his loved ones were fraught with challenges. Lila's influence was pervasive, and she used every tool at her disposal to maintain her control over him. However, the seeds of doubt had been planted in Emmett's mind. He began to see through Lila's facade, recognizing her manipulative tactics for what they were. The more he tried to reconnect with his family and friends, the more determined he became to regain his independence and escape from Lila's clutches. The tension between Emmett and Lila reached a boiling point one fateful evening. Emmett had been secretly meeting with his sister Rachel, seeking her support and advice on how to extricate himself from Lila's control. Rachel, deeply concerned for her brother's well-being, urged him to leave Lila and return to his family. Emmett, emboldened by his sister's encouragement, decided it was time to confront Lila and end their toxic relationship. Emmett chose a quiet Sunday afternoon to break the news to Lila. He hoped that the calmness of the day would help keep the situation from escalating. As they sat in their living room, Emmett took a deep breath and told Lila that he needed some space and time apart. He explained that he felt suffocated and isolated, and that he needed to reconnect with his family and friends to find himself again. Lila's reaction was immediate and explosive. She accused Emmett of being ungrateful and selfish, of abandoning the relationship they had built together. Her voice rose in anger, and she began to hurl insults and accusations, attempting to undermine Emmett's resolve. She claimed that his family and friends didn't truly care about him, that they only wanted to control him and pull him away from her. Emmett tried to remain calm, but Lila's relentless tirade wore him down. He felt a mix of anger, guilt, and sadness as he listened to her venomous words. Despite her emotional manipulation, Emmett knew that he couldn't continue living under her control. He stood his ground, repeating his need for space and asserting that he was making the decision for his own well-being. Lila, realizing that her usual tactics were not working, shifted her approach. She broke down in tears, pleading with Emmett to reconsider. She promised to change, to give him more freedom, and to be more understanding. Emmett, seeing through her manipulative behavior, remained firm in his decision. He told her that he needed to leave, and that it was the best thing for both of them. The atmosphere in the room grew tense and charged with emotion. Lila's tears quickly turned to anger again, and she lashed out, accusing Emmett of cheating and betrayal. Emmett, exhausted and emotionally drained, decided to leave the house for a while to clear his head. He grabbed his jacket and walked out the door, leaving Lila seething with rage. When Emmett finally returned home, he found Lila waiting for him, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She approached him with a calm demeanor, apologizing for her outburst and begging for another chance. Emmett, though sympathetic to her pain, stood his ground and reiterated his need for space. That night, as Emmett tried to sleep, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Lila's behavior had become increasingly erratic, and he feared that her desperation might drive her to do something drastic. His instincts were correct. In the early hours of the morning, Emmett was awakened by a noise in the living room. He got up to investigate and found Lila sitting on the couch, clutching a large kitchen knife. Her eyes were wild with desperation and anger. Emmett's heart raced as he tried to talk her down, but Lila's mind was made up. She accused Emmett of ruining her life, of turning everyone against her. In a fit of rage, she lunged at him with the knife. Emmett managed to dodge her initial attack, but Lila was relentless. A struggle ensued, with Emmett trying to disarm Lila while avoiding her frantic swings. In the chaos, Lila's grip on the knife slipped, and Emmett seized the opportunity to wrest it from her hand. In the aftermath of the struggle, both were left breathless and shaken. Emmett, now holding the knife, dropped it and stepped back, giving Lila space to calm down. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Emmett knew he had to leave. He quickly packed a bag and, without looking back, walked out of the house, leaving Lila behind. He drove to his parents' home, where he was welcomed with open arms as he told them everything that just happened. Emmett knew that the road to recovery would be long and difficult, but he was ready to take the first step. Lila, consumed by a mix of rage and despair, couldn't accept the loss of control over Emmett. Her mind raced with thoughts of revenge and retribution. She felt humiliated and abandoned, and her desperation turned into a dangerous resolve. In the days following Emmett's departure, Lila's behavior became increasingly insane. She spent hours pacing the house, plotting ways to regain control over Emmett. Her anger festered, and she began to see his decision to leave as an unforgivable betrayal. Lila convinced herself that Emmett's family and friends were to blame for his decision, and she resolved to make him pay for abandoning her. One evening, as Emmett was visiting his parents, Lila devised a plan. She knew that Emmett often took a walk through a secluded part of town in the evenings to clear his head. She decided to confront him there, away from prying eyes. Armed with the same kitchen knife from their previous altercation, Lila set out to intercept Emmett. As Emmett approached a secluded park, he was startled to see Lila standing there, her eyes fixed on him. He stopped in his tracks, a mix of fear and sadness washing over him. Lila's appearance was disheveled, and her eyes burned with a dangerous intensity. Emmett knew that this confrontation could not end well. Lila's voice was cold and menacing, as she accused Emmett of ruining her life. She blamed him for her misery and demanded that he return to her. Emmett tried to reason with her, explaining that their relationship was toxic and that he needed to move on for his own well-being. But Lila was beyond reason. In a sudden violent outburst, Lila lunged at Emmett with the knife. Emmett tried to defend himself, but Lila's rage gave her a frightening strength. A struggle ensued, with Emmett desperately trying to disarm her. In the chaos, Lila managed to stab Emmett, the blade piercing his side. Emmett cried out in pain, but Lila showed no signs of stopping. As Emmett fell to the ground, clutching his wound, Lila stood over him, her face contorted with fury and madness. Emmett, weakened and bleeding, pleaded with her to stop, but his words fell on deaf ears. Lila, consumed by her desire for control and revenge, delivered a final fatal blow. The once peaceful park was now a crime scene, with Emmett lying lifeless on the ground. Lila, covered in his blood, stood there for a moment, her mind slowly registering the reality of what she had done. Realizing that she couldn't stay there, Lila fled the scene, leaving Emmett's body behind. She drove aimlessly through the night, her mind racing with thoughts of escape. She knew that it was only a matter of time before the police would come looking for her. The next morning, Emmett's body was discovered by a passerby who immediately called the police. The murder of Emmett Dalton sent shockwaves through the community, a town unaccustomed to such violence. The local police, led by Detective Samuel Carter, launched a thorough investigation to uncover the truth behind Emmett's tragic death. As the news spread, the tight-knit community rallied around Emmett's family, offering support and demanding justice. Detective Carter, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for solving complex cases, began his work by examining the crime scene. The secluded park where Emmett's body was found offered little in the way of witnesses, but the brutality of the attack indicated a crime of passion.
The wounds on Emmett's body suggested a frenzied assault, pointing to someone who knew him well. The investigation quickly focused on Lila Renshaw, Emmett's estranged girlfriend. Neighbors and acquaintances described their tumultuous relationship, with several recounting instances of Lila's controlling behavior. Emmett's family provided crucial insights into the couple's recent conflicts and Emmett's attempts to distance himself from Lila. These testimonies painted a picture of a relationship marked by manipulation, culminating in a fatal confrontation. Detective Carter and his team conducted a thorough search of Lila's home, uncovering several pieces of incriminating evidence. They found Emmett's blood on Lila's clothing and the kitchen knife used in the attack hidden in a drawer. Lila's phone records showed multiple calls to Emmett on the night of the murder, further implicating her in the crime. As the evidence mounted, the police issued an arrest warrant for Lila. She was located in a rundown motel on the outskirts of town, attempting to evade capture. When the police arrived, Lila offered little resistance, her demeanor one of resignation. The trial was a highly publicized event, drawing attention from the local community. Emmett's family attended every session, their presence a poignant reminder of the loss they had suffered. The prosecution presented a compelling case, detailing Lila's manipulative behavior and the violent nature of the crime. Witnesses testified about Lila's possessiveness and her efforts to isolate Emmett from his loved ones. Lila's defense team attempted to portray her as a victim of circumstance, arguing that she had acted in a moment of emotional turmoil. However, the overwhelming evidence, coupled with Lila's lack of remorse, left little room for doubt. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning a guilty verdict. Lila was sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. Her conviction brought a sense of closure to Emmett's family, though the pain of their loss would never fully heal. The community mourned the senseless death of one of its own, grappling with the realization that such darkness could exist in their midst. The story of Emmett Dalton and Lila Renshaw became a lasting reminder of the importance of recognizing and addressing the signs of abuse. It highlighted the need for community support and the power of collective action in creating a safer world for everyone. John Harrison, a respected local businessman, was found murdered in his own home. The evidence soon pointed towards his wife, Emily, sparking a scandal that would unravel a complex web of lies, twisted love triangles, deceit, and dark secrets. Emily Harrison, a beautiful woman in her mid-30s, had always been the center of attention. Her previous marriage to Michael Turner had ended amicably, or so it seemed. John, her current husband, had a strained relationship with his younger brother, David. This strained dynamic hid deeper, more sinister connections that would come to light as the investigation unfolded. The murder of John Harrison was not a straightforward case. It was the catalyst that exposed a convoluted love triangle, revealing that everyone involved had motives buried beneath layers of pretense and propriety. Detective Sarah Miller and her partner, Detective Tom Reynolds, would soon find themselves entangled in a case that defied simple explanations. The night of the murder, Emily's scream pierced the quiet neighborhood. The first responders arrived at the Harrison residence to find Emily in a state of hysteria, her clothes stained with blood. John's body lay sprawled on the living room floor, a deep gash across his throat. Blood pooled around him, soaking into the carpet. The scene was chaotic, with furniture overturned and signs of a struggle evident. Officer Daniels, the first on the scene, quickly secured the area. He observed Emily, who was sobbing uncontrollably, clutching a framed photo of her and John. Her hands trembled as she tried to explain what had happened. "I found him like this. I came home and he was just lying there. I didn't know what to do." Her voice was shaky, her eyes wide with terror, but there was something in her demeanor that didn't quite add up. She was too composed, too rehearsed. Detective Miller arrived shortly after, her keen eyes taking in every detail. She noted the absence of forced entry and the fact that John seemed to have been caught off guard. It suggested that he knew his attacker. Miller's gut instinct told her that this was more than just a burglary gone wrong. As the forensic team began their work, Miller pulled Emily aside for a more detailed statement. Emily recounted her day, carefully avoiding eye contact. She claimed to have been out shopping and returned to find John dead. But there were inconsistencies in her story, small details that didn't align.
Detective Reynolds joined Miller, his expression grim. He had spoken with the neighbors, who reported hearing raised voices earlier in the evening. None could identify the second voice, but it was clear that John had not been alone before his death. Miller looked at Reynolds. "This isn't a simple case, Tom. There's more to this than meets the eye." Reynolds nodded in agreement. "Let's dig deeper. Something tells me we're only scratching the surface." The investigation into John Harrison's murder kicked off in earnest the following day. Detectives Miller and Reynolds began their meticulous process of gathering evidence and conducting interviews. The first step was to build a timeline of John's final hours. They discovered that John had left his office around 5 p.m., a bit earlier than usual. His assistant mentioned that he seemed preoccupied, almost distracted. Emily's account placed her at the local mall during this time, but there were no security camera records to confirm her presence. Detective Miller focused on Emily's behavior. She seemed cooperative, yet there was an underlying current of tension. During questioning, Emily maintained her story but frequently glanced at her phone as if expecting a message or call. Miller made a mental note to check her phone records. Meanwhile, Reynolds delved into John's professional life. As a successful real estate developer, John had made a few enemies. Business rivals and disgruntled former employees formed a list of potential suspects. However, none seemed to have a motive strong enough for murder. As they dug deeper, the detectives learned more about Emily's past. Her previous marriage to Michael Turner had ended 5 years ago. The divorce was amicable on paper, but whispers of infidelity and financial disputes lingered. Michael had moved out of town but returned occasionally, supposedly to visit his daughter from another relationship. Detective Miller decided to pay Michael a visit. He lived in a modest apartment on the outskirts of Willow Creek. Michael was a tall, brooding man with a rugged charm. He appeared genuinely shocked when Miller informed him of John's murder. "Emily called me last night," he said, his voice tinged with concern. "She was hysterical, said John was dead. I told her to call the police and then I rushed over. But by the time I got there, the place was crawling with cops. Michael's alibi was shaky, but there was no concrete evidence linking him to the crime." Miller noted his reaction and decided to keep him under surveillance. Back at the station, Reynolds had uncovered a new lead. David Harrison, John's younger brother, had been seen arguing with John several days before the murder. David, a charming but aimless man, had always lived in his brother's shadow. He harbored a deep resentment towards John, fueled by jealousy and financial dependence. David was brought in for questioning. He was visibly nervous, his eyes darting around the room as he spoke. "John and I argued about money," he admitted. "He was going to cut me off, but I didn't kill him." The detectives were skeptical. David's alibi for the night of the murder was weak. He claimed to have been at a bar, but no one could confirm his presence. As they continued to press him, David's story began to unravel. Emily's suspicious behavior, Michael's shaky alibi, and David's deep-seated resentment formed a tangled web. The detectives realized they were dealing with more than just a crime of passion. There were layers of deceit and hidden motives that needed to be peeled back, one by one. John and Emily Harrison appeared to be the quintessential suburban couple. They had a beautiful home, a successful business, and were well-liked in their community. But beneath the veneer of their perfect life, cracks were beginning to show. John had built his real estate empire from the ground up. He was known for his business acumen and ruthless negotiating tactics. However, his professional success came at a personal cost. John's demanding work schedule left little time for his marriage, creating a rift between him and Emily. Emily, on the other hand, had a more complex past. Raised in a wealthy family, she was accustomed to a life of privilege. Her first marriage to Michael Turner had been a whirlwind romance. Michael was a charismatic entrepreneur, but his business ventures often ended in failure. Their relationship was passionate but tumultuous, marked by frequent arguments and infidelity. The divorce had been bitter, with Emily accusing Michael of cheating and financial mismanagement. Michael, in turn, claimed that Emily's spending habits had driven him to the brink of bankruptcy. Despite the acrimony, they managed to part ways without too much public scandal. Michael left town, but he never completely severed ties with Emily. John entered Emily's life shortly after her divorce. He offered stability and security, something she desperately needed. Their courtship was swift, and they married within a year. However, the transition from a tumultuous relationship to a stable one was not easy for Emily. She missed the excitement and unpredictability that Michael had brought into her life. David Harrison, John's younger brother, was another significant figure in the unfolding drama. David had always been the black sheep of the family. He struggled with various addictions and had a string of failed business ventures. John often bailed him out, creating a sense of dependency and resentment. David's relationship with Emily was complex. They had an undeniable chemistry, and their interactions were often charged with unspoken tension. Emily confided in David about her marital problems, and he, in turn, found solace in her company. It was clear to the detectives that there was more to their relationship than met the eye. As Miller and Reynolds dug deeper, they discovered that John had recently made some significant financial moves. He had taken out a large life insurance policy and transferred substantial assets into Emily's name. These actions suggested that John was either planning for the future or anticipating something dire. Emily's spending habits had also come under scrutiny. Despite her outward appearance of concern and grief, her bank records revealed large withdrawals and unexplained expenses. The detectives began to suspect that she might have been planning to leave John and start a new life elsewhere. Michael Turner, though seemingly out of the picture, still harbored feelings for Emily. He had recently come back into town and had been seen meeting with her on several occasions. Their interactions were friendly on the surface, but there was an undercurrent of unresolved tension and unspoken words. The background checks painted a picture of a marriage on the brink, with each character hiding their true intentions behind a facade of normalcy. John was the pillar of the community, Emily the perfect wife, David the troubled brother, and Michael the ex-husband with lingering feelings. But as the detectives would soon discover, appearances could be deceiving. As the investigation progressed, the detectives focused on uncovering the motives behind John Harrison's murder. Each of the main players had reasons, both hidden and overt, that could drive them to such an extreme act. Emily's financial troubles were the most glaring. Despite John's success, their finances were strained. Emily's lavish lifestyle had put them in significant debt. The large life insurance policy John had recently taken out added a sinister layer to this financial stress. If Emily were to benefit from John's death, it would solve all her money problems. Emily's affair with David complicated matters further. Their relationship was more than just a fleeting romance. It was a deeply emotional bond, forged out of mutual dissatisfaction and dependency. Michael Turner also had a motive. His lingering feelings for Emily and the unresolved bitterness from their divorce created a volatile mix. Michael's financial instability made him susceptible to desperate measures. His frequent visits to Emily hinted at a rekindled relationship, which could have easily turned into a conspiracy against John. David's resentment towards his brother was well documented. He had lived in John's shadow for most of his life, relying on him for financial support. The argument they had days before the murder centered on money and control. John had threatened to cut David off, a move that would leave him destitute. David's dependence on John created a deep-seated hatred that could have driven him to murder. The detectives also considered the possibility of a joint effort between Emily and David. Their affair, coupled with their financial motives, made them prime suspects. If they conspired together, they could both benefit immensely from John's death. Emily would gain financial freedom, and David would rid himself of his brother's dominance. One evening, Detective Miller received a call from a local bartender who claimed to have seen Emily and David together on the night of the murder. According to the bartender, they appeared to be in an intense conversation, their body language suggesting more than just a casual encounter. This new information put both Emily and David at the scene of the crime around the estimated time of death. Miller and Reynolds brought Emily in for further questioning. Confronted with the bartender's testimony, Emily's composure began to crack. She admitted to meeting David, but insisted they were discussing her troubled marriage and had nothing to do with John's death. David, on the other hand, was less forthcoming. When questioned about his whereabouts, he became defensive and evasive. His alibi, which had already been weak, now seemed even more questionable. The detectives pressed him on his relationship with Emily and the nature of their conversation that night, but David stuck to his story of innocence. Michael Turner also remained a person of interest. His frequent visits to Emily, coupled with his financial troubles, made him a viable suspect. In the midst of these revelations, the detectives encountered several red herrings. One such distraction came in the form of an anonymous tip, suggesting that John was involved in illegal activities. The tip claimed that John had been laundering money through his real estate business. While this lead initially seemed promising, further investigation revealed it to be unfounded. It appeared to be a deliberate attempt to divert the detectives' attention from the true motives behind the murder. Another false lead came from a disgruntled former employee of John's. The employee had a history of making threats against John and had been fired under contentious circumstances. However, after a thorough investigation, it became clear that he had no involvement in the murder. His threats were merely empty words born out of frustration and resentment. The turning point came when Detective Reynolds discovered a series of text messages between Emily and Michael. The messages revealed a rekindling of their romantic relationship and discussed plans to meet secretly. One message in particular stood out. Sent on the day of the murder, it read, "We need to act tonight. John can't find out." Armed with this new evidence, Miller and Reynolds confronted Emily and Michael separately. Emily broke down under the pressure, partially confessing to the affair but denying any involvement in the murder. Michael, however, maintained his innocence, insisting that the messages were taken out of context. The breakthrough in the case came when Detective Miller decided to take a closer look at the phone records and financial transactions. She believed that these would provide the concrete evidence needed to tie the suspects to the crime. The phone records revealed a flurry of calls and messages between Emily, David, and Michael in the days leading up to the murder. The communication pattern suggested a coordinated effort, with Emily at the center. On the night of the murder, there were several calls between Emily and David, as well as a brief call to Michael. This triangulation of communication placed all three suspects in contact during the critical hours. Miller also discovered an unusual transaction in Emily's bank account. A large sum of money had been transferred to an offshore account just days before John's death. This transaction, combined with the life insurance policy, suggested that Emily was preparing for a significant change in her financial situation. Armed with this new evidence, the detectives decided to confront Emily once more. This time, they presented her with the phone records and the financial transactions. Faced with irrefutable evidence, Emily's facade of innocence began to crumble. Emily's voice trembled as she spoke. "I didn't want it to come to this. I just wanted out. John was controlling, suffocating. I needed a way out, but I never wanted him dead." Miller pressed further. "Who did you talk to that night, Emily? Why were you and David in contact so frequently?" Emily hesitated, her eyes welling with tears. "David and I, we had a plan. We were going to leave John, start fresh, but I swear we never planned to kill him." The detectives knew they needed to hear David's side of the story. When they brought him in for questioning, David initially denied any involvement, but when confronted with the phone records and Emily's partial confession, his resolve weakened. David admitted to meeting Emily on the night of the murder, but claimed that their plan was only to confront John, not to harm him. Emily had convinced him that John would never let her go, and that they needed to make him understand that their relationship was over. Michael's involvement became clearer as the detectives reviewed his financial records. They discovered that he had received a substantial sum of money from an unknown source shortly after John's death. This payment, coupled with the text messages, suggested that Michael was part of the conspiracy. The detectives decided to bring all three suspects in together. In a tense confrontation, they laid out the evidence. Emily's breakdown, David's nervousness, and Michael's defiance created a volatile atmosphere. Miller addressed them. "We know about the affair. We know about the money. It's time to come clean. Who killed John?" Emily, tears streaming down her face, finally confessed. "It was an accident. We confronted John, things got heated, and David lost control. He didn't mean to kill him." David's face paled as he stammered, "It was self-defense. John attacked me and I just reacted. I didn't mean for it to end this way." Michael, realizing the gravity of the situation, added, "I was supposed to help them disappear after. I never thought it would go this far." The detectives had the pieces they needed. The confrontation had turned violent, leading to John's accidental death. Emily and David had panicked, and Michael had stepped in to help cover it up. The murder was a tragic result of a plan gone horribly wrong. With the confessions in hand, the detectives knew they had uncovered the truth. The case was far from simple, but the tangled motives and relationships had finally come to light. The truth was a web of love, betrayal, and desperation. The final confrontation with Emily, David, and Michael marked the culmination of weeks of intense investigation. Detectives Miller and Reynolds had pieced together the intricate puzzle of John Harrison's murder. The courtroom was packed as the trial of Emily, David, and Michael began. The community of Willow Creek, once known for its tranquility, was now a hub of media attention. Reporters and spectators alike were eager to hear the sordid details of the case that had shocked the town. The prosecution laid out a compelling narrative. They described how Emily's affair with David had rekindled old passions and how their relationship had become a desperate escape from her controlling marriage. The prosecution argued that the financial troubles and the life insurance policy created a powerful motive for murder. Emily's defense attorney tried to paint her as a victim of circumstances, a woman trapped in a loveless marriage who made poor decisions in a moment of panic. They emphasized that the murder was unplanned and that Emily had no intention of killing her husband. David's defense focused on self-defense. They highlighted John's aggressive behavior and his attack on David, arguing that David had acted out of fear for his life. They portrayed him as a man pushed to his breaking point by years of familial tension and resentment. Michael's defense was the most straightforward. They claimed he had no prior knowledge of the murder plan and that his involvement was limited to helping Emily out of misguided loyalty. He was depicted as an unwitting accomplice, caught up in a situation beyond his control. Throughout the trial, the detectives' meticulous work came to light. The phone records, financial transactions, and confessions all painted a vivid picture of the events leading up to John's death. The jury listened intently as the prosecution and defense presented their cases. On the stand, Emily was a picture of remorse. She recounted the night of the murder in vivid detail, her voice breaking as she described the confrontation with John. Tears streamed down her face as she spoke of her regret and fear. "I loved John," she said, her voice trembling, "but I felt trapped. When David and I confronted him, everything spiraled out of control. I never wanted this to happen." David's testimony was equally emotional. He described the years of living in John's shadow, the constant feeling of inadequacy, and the moment of terror when John attacked him. "I just wanted to protect myself," he said, his voice cracking. "I never meant to kill him. It was an accident." Michael, in his testimony, admitted to helping Emily cover up the murder, but insisted he had no part in the actual killing. "I made a terrible mistake," he said. "I thought I was helping a friend, but I realize now how wrong I was." The prosecution's closing argument was powerful. They emphasized the premeditation involved in the affair and the financial motives. They argued that while the murder might not have been meticulously planned, it was the result of a series of deliberate actions taken by Emily and David. The defense's closing arguments focused on the emotional and psychological aspects of the case. They pleaded for leniency, highlighting the lack of premeditation and the complex web of emotions that led to the tragic event. After several days of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. Emily and David were found guilty of second-degree murder, acknowledging the crime's emotional context, but also the gravity of their actions. Michael was found guilty of being an accessory after the fact, his role in the cover-up undeniable, but his involvement in the murder itself less clear. As the verdicts were read, the courtroom was silent. Emily Harrison was sentenced to 20 years in prison. David Harrison received a 15-year sentence. Michael Turner, though less directly involved, was sentenced to 5 years for his role in the cover-up. The twisted love triangle that led to John Harrison's murder had unraveled, but its impact would be felt for years to come. The truth, once uncovered, had brought justice, but it had also revealed the depths of human frailty and the devastating consequences of unchecked desires. Jennifer Ashcroft, a strikingly beautiful 52-year-old woman, had built her fortune in the cutthroat world of biotech. Her company was at the forefront of brain interface technology, and Jennifer was known for her razor-sharp intellect and unyielding determination. She moved through life with the confidence of someone who always got what she wanted, whether in the boardroom or the bedroom. A 20-year-old Ryan Breslin, with his brooding good looks, seemed an unlikely match for the poised and polished Jennifer. A college dropout with a troubled past, Ryan had drifted through a series of dead-end jobs before a chance encounter with Jennifer changed the trajectory of his life. Their relationship, while unconventional, appeared to offer both parties what they desired. For Jennifer, a vibrant young companion to stave off loneliness, and for Ryan, financial security and a taste of luxury he had never known. For nearly a year, Their arrangement flourished in the shadows of Riverton. But as summer gave way to autumn, a shift in their delicate dynamic would set in motion a chain of events that would end in bloodshed, leaving the community to grapple with the dark undercurrents that had been flowing beneath its pristine surface all along. Jennifer Ashcroft's path to wealth and power began in the middle-class suburbs of Boston. Born to a high school chemistry teacher and a librarian, young Jennifer showed an early aptitude for science and an insatiable curiosity about the human mind. Her parents, recognizing her potential, scrimped and saved to provide her with every educational opportunity they could afford. At 16, Jennifer's life took a dramatic turn when her science fair project on neurotransmitters caught the eye of a visiting professor from MIT. Impressed by her precocious talent, he became her mentor, guiding her through accelerated studies and into the prestigious neuroscience program at MIT. It was here that Jennifer's ambition truly took flight. During her graduate studies, Jennifer's research into neuroplasticity attracted the attention of several biotech startups. By 25, she had secured her first patent, a fledgling company working on brain-computer interfaces. Under Jennifer's leadership, the company flourished, its stock price soaring as breakthroughs in the technology made headlines. With each success, Jennifer's wealth and influence grew, but so did her reputation for ruthlessness. Former colleagues spoke in hushed tones of her ability to charm and manipulate, to identify weaknesses and exploit them mercilessly. Jennifer's personal life was marked by a series of short-lived marriages, each ending as her partners found themselves unable to compete with her true passion, her work. Her first husband, a fellow researcher she met at MIT, lasted 3 years before filing for divorce, citing emotional neglect. The second, a charming venture capitalist, made it to year 5 before Jennifer's suspicions of his infidelity led to an acrimonious split. After her third divorce at 48, from a younger art dealer who claimed she had become obsessively controlling, Jennifer swore off traditional relationships. Instead, she began to seek out the company of much younger men, drawn to their vitality and the uncomplicated nature of purely transactional arrangements. It was a lifestyle that suited her, allowing her to maintain control while satisfying her needs for companionship and physical intimacy. Yet as Jennifer approached her 50s, a creeping sense of loneliness began to gnaw at her. It was this vulnerability, carefully hidden beneath her polished exterior, that would leave her susceptible to the intoxicating allure of Ryan Breslin and the destructive jealousy that would follow. Ryan Breslin's early life stood in stark contrast to Jennifer's. Born in a small town in rural Pennsylvania, Ryan was the youngest of 4 children in a family perpetually teetering on the edge of poverty. His father, a long-haul trucker with a penchant for alcohol, was rarely home. His mother, overwhelmed and battling depression, struggled to keep the family afloat. From a young age, Ryan learned to fend for himself. Blessed with good looks and natural charm, he discovered early on that these attributes could be leveraged to his advantage. By high school, Ryan had perfected the art of getting by with minimal effort, relying on his charisma to smooth over his academic shortcomings and disciplinary issues. Despite his lackluster academic performance, Ryan's SAT scores were surprisingly high, hinting at an intelligence he rarely applied to his studies. This, combined with his prowess on the basketball court, earned him a scholarship to a small liberal arts college in Philadelphia. However, the freedom of college life proved too tempting for Ryan. Away from the watchful eyes of his family and high school teachers, he fell in with a party crowd. His grades plummeted, and by the end of his freshman year, Ryan had lost his scholarship. Too ashamed to return home, he decided to stay in Philadelphia, bouncing between low-wage jobs and crashing on friends' couches. It was during this aimless period that Ryan's path intersected with Jennifer's. Working as a barista in an upscale cafe frequented by business executives, Ryan caught Jennifer's eye one rainy Tuesday morning. She was struck by his easy smile and the hint of vulnerability behind his confident demeanor. For Ryan, Jennifer represented everything he thought he wanted: sophistication, success, and the promise of a life far removed from his humble beginnings. Their initial flirtation quickly evolved into something more. Jennifer, intrigued by Ryan's raw potential and eager to shape him into her ideal companion, offered him a proposition. She would provide him with financial support, introduce him to her world of luxury and refinement in exchange for his exclusive companionship. For Ryan, faced with mounting debts and dwindling prospects, The offer seemed too good to refuse. Seizing the opportunity, Jennifer invited him as her guest, her tone making it clear that this was more than a casual invitation. The gallery opening marked the beginning of Ryan's induction into Jennifer's world. She arrived at his shabby apartment, presenting him with a tailored suit that fit him perfectly. As they moved through the event, Jennifer expertly guided Ryan, whispering explanations about the art and introducing him to her circles as her young protege. For Ryan, the evening was intoxicating. He found himself easily slipping into the role of the charming, artistic young man, feeding off the approving glances and engaging conversations with Jennifer's peers. As the night wore on, the attraction between them grew palpable, culminating in a passionate encounter back at Jennifer's penthouse. In the afterglow, Jennifer laid out her proposition. She would provide Ryan with a generous monthly allowance, pay for his education if he chose to return to college, and introduce him to opportunities he could only dream of. In return, she expected his companionship, discretion, and exclusivity. Ryan, seeing a chance to reinvent himself and escape his directionless existence, agreed without hesitation. The following months were a whirlwind for Ryan. Jennifer moved him into the guest house on her estate, replacing his wardrobe with designer labels and introducing him to the finer things in life. She enrolled him in art appreciation classes, hired a personal trainer to hone his already impressive physique, and taught him the nuances of wine tasting and fine dining. Jennifer took immense pleasure in molding Ryan, viewing him as both a project and a prized possession. She reveled in the envious glances they received when they attended events together, proudly showing off her attractive young companion. For Ryan, the relationship offered security and excitement in equal measure. He threw himself into his new role with enthusiasm, eager to prove his worth and maintain the lifestyle to which he was quickly becoming accustomed. Their physical relationship was passionate and adventurous, with Jennifer introducing Ryan to experiences he had never imagined. She pushed his boundaries, always maintaining control, a dynamic that spilled over into other aspects of their relationship. As summer turned to fall, Jennifer and Ryan settled into a rhythm of lavish vacations, social events, and intimate evenings at home. To the outside world, they appeared to be an unconventional but happy couple. However, beneath the surface, the seeds of codependency and obsession were taking root, setting the stage for the turmoil that was to come. The delicate balance of Jennifer and Ryan's relationship began to shift with the arrival of Aria Thornton, a 20-year-old art history major at the local university. Aria entered their lives innocuously enough, as a part-time docent at the Museum of Modern Art. Ryan first encountered Aria during one of his frequent visits to the museum, a habit encouraged by Jennifer to further his art education. Aria was leading a tour group, her passion for the artwork evident in her animated descriptions and insightful commentary. Ryan found himself drawn to her enthusiasm, so different from Jennifer's calculated appreciation of art as a status symbol. After the tour, Ryan approached Aria, engaging her in a discussion about the exhibition. Their conversation flowed easily, punctuated by shared laughter and a palpable sense of connection. For the first time in months, Ryan felt truly seen for who he was, rather than as an extension of Jennifer. Aria, with her vibrant style and infectious laugh, represented everything that Jennifer was not. Where Jennifer was polished and restrained, Aria was spontaneous and expressive. Her youth and energy resonated with Ryan, reminding him of the pure relationships he had sacrificed for his arrangement with Jennifer. Over the next few weeks, Ryan found himself visiting the museum more frequently, always managing to time his visits with Aria's shifts. Their friendship blossomed quickly, bonding over shared interests in art, music, and philosophy. Aria introduced Ryan to her world of college parties, indie film screenings, and late-night discussions in 24-hour diners. For Ryan, these interactions with Aria and her friends were a breath of fresh air. He rediscovered parts of himself that had been suppressed in his relationship with Jennifer, including his own artistic aspirations. Aria encouraged him to pursue his interest in photography, even gifting him a vintage camera she had found at a flea market. As Ryan spent more time with Aria, he began to question the nature of his relationship with Jennifer. The stark contrast between the genuine connection he felt with Aria and the transactional nature of his arrangement with Jennifer became increasingly apparent. He found himself manufacturing excuses to spend time away from the estate, his thoughts constantly drifting to Aria, Unbeknownst to Ryan, his changing behavior and growing distraction had not gone unnoticed by Jennifer. Her keen instincts, honed by years of corporate maneuvering, sensed a shift in their dynamic. As Ryan pulled away, Jennifer's determination to maintain control over him only intensified, setting the stage for the conflict that would ultimately lead to tragedy. The first signs of trouble were subtle. Jennifer noticed Ryan checking his phone more frequently, his face lighting up at certain messages. He began to spend more time at the museum, citing a newfound passion for contemporary art. While Jennifer initially encouraged this interest, a nagging suspicion began to take root in her mind. One evening, as they prepared for a charity gala, Jennifer casually asked about Ryan's day at the museum. His response was enthusiastic, filled with details about a new exhibition. But it was the mention of Aria, the incredibly knowledgeable docent, that caught Jennifer's attention. The way Ryan's eyes sparkled as he spoke of her set off alarm bells in Jennifer's head. Determined to uncover the truth, Jennifer began to monitor Ryan more closely. She installed a GPS tracker on his phone under the guise of a security upgrade. She hired a private investigator to follow him during his outings. The reports she received confirmed her worst fears. Ryan was spending considerable time with a young woman, their body language indicating a clear attraction. As evidence of Ryan's growing connection with Aria mounted, Jennifer's jealousy festered. She oscillated between icy detachment and clingy desperation, her moods becoming increasingly unpredictable. One moment she would shower Ryan with expensive gifts. The next, she would subject him to passive-aggressive comments and veiled threats. Jennifer's behavior began to affect her professional life as well. She became distracted during important meetings, snapping at employees for minor infractions. Her assistant noticed an increase in her alcohol consumption, often finding empty wine bottles in her office trash. Unable to contain her suspicions any longer, Jennifer confronted Ryan after a particularly late night out. She demanded to know where he had been, accusing him of betraying her trust. Ryan, caught off guard, attempted to downplay his friendship with Aria, insisting that Jennifer was overreacting. The argument escalated quickly, with Jennifer reminding Ryan of everything she had done for him and insinuating that he owed her his loyalty. This confrontation marked a turning point in their relationship. Ryan, feeling trapped and resentful of Jennifer's possessiveness, began to withdraw further. He became more guarded with his phone, careful not to mention Aria, and invented elaborate excuses for his absences. Jennifer, driven by her growing paranoia, intensified her efforts to control Ryan. She insisted on accompanying him to art events, her possessive body language sending a clear message to anyone who approached them. She surprised him with impromptu visits to the museum, her sharp eyes scanning for any sign of the young docent who had captured Ryan's attention. As the weeks wore on, the emotional chasm between Jennifer and Ryan widened. Their once passionate encounters became mechanical, tinged with an undercurrent of resentment. Jennifer's jealousy morphed into an obsession, consuming her thoughts and driving her to increasingly desperate measures to keep Ryan by her side. Little did she know that her possessive love was pushing Ryan further away, steering them both towards a confrontation that would have fatal consequences. As Jennifer's jealousy intensified, she embarked on a calculated campaign to maintain control over Ryan. Drawing on the same strategic thinking that had made her a formidable businesswoman, she deployed a range of manipulation tactics designed to keep Ryan dependent on her and isolated from Aria's influence. Jennifer's first move was to exploit Ryan's financial dependence. She began to withhold his allowance, citing fictitious issues with her accounts or claiming she needed to reallocate funds for business purposes. When Ryan expressed concern, she would relent, but not before extracting promises of increased commitment and time spent together. Emotional manipulation became Jennifer's primary weapon. She oscillated between lavishing Ryan with affection and subjecting him to prolonged periods of icy silence. This hot and cold treatment left Ryan constantly off balance, never sure where he stood. Jennifer also employed more subtle tactics to isolate Ryan from potential support systems. She scheduled trips that conveniently coincided with plans Ryan had made with friends. She expressed concern about his old acquaintances, implying they were a bad influence or simply using him for his newfound status. Gradually, Ryan's social circle shrank, leaving Jennifer as his primary source of companionship and validation. In moments of perceived threat, Jennifer would remind Ryan of all she had done for him, framing her controlling behavior as acts of love and generosity. She'd recount how she had rescued him from a life of poverty and obscurity, implying that without her, he would be nothing. These guilt trips served to reinforce Ryan's sense of obligation and indebtedness to Jennifer. As Ryan continued to pull out, Jennifer's tactics grew more desperate. She began to fake health scares, claiming stress-induced migraines or fainting spells that mysteriously coincided with times Ryan wanted to go out alone. Her performance was so convincing that Ryan often canceled his plans out of genuine concern for her well-being. Through this web of manipulation, Jennifer sought to create a reality where Ryan believed he needed her, where his autonomy was slowly eroded until staying with her seemed like the only viable option. Yet, with each manipulative act, she was pushing Ryan closer to his breaking point, fueling a resentment that would soon boil over with devastating consequences. During one of her clandestine investigations into Ryan's past, Jennifer uncovered a secret that she believed would give her the ultimate leverage. Through her network of private investigators, she learned that Ryan had been involved in a car accident during his freshman year of college. The accident had resulted in a serious injury to another student, but Ryan had fled the scene in a panic. The case had gone cold due to lack of evidence, but Jennifer now held the missing pieces. Armed with this explosive information, Jennifer carefully planned her approach. She waited for a moment when Ryan was particularly vulnerable, after a heated argument about his increasing absences. As Ryan turned to leave, Jennifer calmly mentioned the accident. The color drained from Ryan's face as he slowly turned back to her. Jennifer laid out the facts with cold precision, producing police reports. She made it clear that she possessed enough evidence to reopen the case and implicate Ryan. The unspoken threat hung heavy in the air. If Ryan didn't comply with her wishes, she would turn the information over to the authorities. The revelation shattered Ryan. The accident had been the catalyst for his downward spiral in college, the guilt eating away at him for years. He had convinced himself that by leaving his old life behind, he could escape his past. Now that illusion was cruelly stripped away. Jennifer pressed her advantage, presenting Ryan with a choice. He could recommit to their relationship, cut all ties with Arya, and follow Jennifer's rules to the letter. Or she would expose his secret, ruining his life and possibly sending him to prison. Trapped and desperate, Ryan initially agreed to Jennifer's demands. He stopped visiting the museum, ignored Arya's increasingly worried messages, and became a virtual prisoner in Jennifer's gilded cage. Jennifer reveled in her victory, believing she had finally secured Ryan's unwavering loyalty. However, the weight of the blackmail soon began to take its toll on both of them. Ryan became withdrawn and depressed, his once vibrant personality dulled by the constant stress of living under threat. He went through the motions of their relationship, but the spark that had initially drawn Jennifer to him was extinguished. Jennifer, for her part, found that her victory left her feeling hollow. The passionate, challenging young man she had fallen for was replaced by a submissive shell. She vacillated between guilt over her actions and frustration at Ryan's listlessness. As weeks passed, the tension in the household became unbearable. Ryan's resentment simmered just below the surface, while Jennifer's paranoia grew. She became convinced that Ryan was plotting against her, looking for a way to neutralize her leverage. The situation was untenable, a powder keg waiting for a spark. That spark would come in the form of a chance encounter that would push Ryan to his limits and set in motion the final fatal confrontation between him and Jennifer. The catalyst for the final confrontation came on a crisp autumn evening. Jennifer had dragged Ryan to a gallery opening, parading him before her peers like a prized possession. As they moved through the crowd, Ryan's eyes locked with a familiar face across the room. It was Arya, looking striking in a vintage dress, her presence a stark reminder of the freedom and genuine connection he had lost. Before Jennifer could react, Ryan mumbled an excuse and fled the gallery. He found himself wandering the streets, his mind racing. The chance encounter with Arya had awakened something in him, a fierce desire for freedom, a reminder of the person he once was and could be again. When Ryan finally returned to the estate in the early hours of the morning, he found Jennifer waiting for him, her face a mask of cold fury. The argument that ensued was unlike any they had before. Ryan, emboldened by his realization and no longer willing to be controlled, confronted Jennifer about her manipulation and blackmail. Jennifer, sensing she was losing her grip on Ryan, resorted to her final play. She reminded him of the evidence she held, threatening not only to expose his past, but to use her influence to destroy any future he might hope to have. She painted a vivid picture of the ruin that awaited him if he dared to leave her. But instead of cowing Ryan, her threats only served to strengthen his resolve. In a moment of clarity, he realized that no future with Jennifer, no matter how luxurious, was worth the price of his soul. With a calmness that belied the turmoil within him, Ryan told Jennifer that he was leaving, regardless of the consequences. Jennifer, faced with the reality of losing Ryan despite her best efforts, snapped. What happened next would shock the community and change both their lives forever. As Ryan turned to leave, Jennifer's composure shattered completely. With a primal scream of rage and desperation, she lunged at him, her manicured nails raking across his face. Ryan, caught off guard by the sudden violence, stumbled backward, knocking over an antique vase that shattered on the marble floor. The sound of breaking porcelain seemed to push Jennifer further into a frenzy. She grabbed a heavy crystal decanter from the bar cart and swung it at Ryan's head. He ducked, the decanter missing him by inches and smashing against the wall, showering them both with glass and expensive scotch. Ryan, realizing the gravity of the situation, tried to restrain Jennifer, pleading with her to calm down. But Jennifer was beyond reason. She clawed at him, kicking and screaming incoherently about betrayal and ingratitude. In the struggle, they careened into Jennifer's prized art collection, paintings crashing to the floor around them. As they grappled, Jennifer's hand closed around a letter opener on her desk, a wicked, ornate thing that was more weapon than office tool. She plunged it toward Ryan's chest. He managed to deflect the blow, but the blade sliced deeply into his arm, drawing a spray of blood. The sight of blood seemed to momentarily snap Jennifer back to reality. She staggered back, the letter opener falling from her suddenly nerveless fingers. Ryan, clutching his bleeding arm, saw an opportunity to escape and made a dash for the door. But Jennifer, in a final desperate act, grabbed his injured arm, yanking him back with surprising strength. Ryan, acting on pure instinct and adrenaline, shoved her away hard. Jennifer stumbled backward, her heel catching on the rug. Time seemed to slow as she fell, her head striking the corner of the heavy marble fireplace with a sickening crack. Jennifer crumpled to the floor, a pool of blood quickly spreading beneath her hair. Ryan stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The room, so recently a scene of chaos, was suddenly terribly still. With trembling hands, Ryan checked for a pulse, finding none. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Jennifer was dead, and his life as he knew it was over. In a daze, he stumbled out of the house into the cool night air, leaving behind a scene of destruction that would soon become the center of a sensational investigation. The grisly discovery was made by Jennifer's housekeeper, Elodia Ramirez, early the next morning. Her screams upon finding her employer's lifeless body shattered the tranquil morning silence of Riverton, bringing neighbors running and prompting a flurry of calls to 911. Detective Lydia Blackwell, a veteran of the Riverton Police Department's Homicide Division, arrived at the scene within the hour. The opulent living room, now a tableau of violence, told a story of a fierce struggle. Broken glass crunched under her feet as she made her initial survey, noting the overturned furniture, shattered artifacts, and the smears of blood that led to Jennifer's body by the fireplace. As crime scene technicians swarmed the house, Detective Blackwell began piecing together the events of the previous night. Security camera footage showed Ryan fleeing the premises in the early hours of the morning, his shirt stained with blood. His swift disappearance made him the prime suspect, and an all-points bulletin was issued for his arrest. As the investigation progressed, a more complex picture began to emerge. Interviews with staff and acquaintances revealed the tumultuous nature of Jennifer and Ryan's relationship. Several witnesses reported hearing frequent arguments and expressed concern about Jennifer's increasingly erratic behavior. A breakthrough came when detectives discovered Jennifer's hidden files detailing her investigation into Ryan's past. The evidence of blackmail added a new dimension to the case, suggesting that Ryan might have been acting in desperation rather than cold-blooded murder. Meanwhile, Ryan remained at large. Sightings were reported across the state, but he managed to elude capture. The turning point in the investigation came from an unexpected source. Aria Thornton, racked with guilt over her role in the events, came forward with crucial information. She provided investigators with text messages and voicemails from Ryan, documenting Jennifer's escalating behavior and his growing fear. Arya's testimony painted a picture of Ryan as a victim of manipulation and abuse, trapped in a gilded cage by Jennifer's wealth and threats. This new perspective prompted Detective Blackwell to dig deeper into Jennifer's past, uncovering a pattern of obsessive behavior and allegations of stalking from her previous relationships. Forensic evidence from the crime scene began to corroborate Ryan's version of events. The angle of Jennifer's fatal injury was consistent with an accidental fall, and defensive wounds on her hands suggested she had been the aggressor in the final confrontation. Perhaps the most damning evidence came from Jennifer's own digital footprint. A thorough examination of her computers revealed the full extent of her surveillance of Ryan, including GPS tracking data and recordings from hidden cameras in their home. The level of invasion and control shocked even the most seasoned investigators. As the true nature of Jennifer and Ryan's relationship came to light, public opinion began to shift. The narrative of the gold-digging boy toy gave way to a more nuanced understanding of a young man trapped in an abusive situation. Initially charged with second-degree murder, Ryan's case took an unexpected turn. As evidence of Jennifer's manipulation and abuse mounted, the district attorney's office faced increasing pressure to reconsider the charges. After lengthy deliberations and negotiations with Ryan's defense team, the charges were reduced to manslaughter. After weeks of testimony and 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned their verdict. Ryan was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter, a verdict that acknowledged his role in Jennifer's death, while also recognizing the extenuating circumstances that led to the fatal confrontation. The judge, taking into account Ryan's lack of prior criminal record and the unusual circumstances of the case, sentenced him to 5 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 3 years. The sentence was met with mixed reactions, some feeling it was too lenient, others arguing that Ryan had already suffered enough.